Winter's breath had grown deeper in the hearts of men. The sky above the north hung low and pale, the clouds moving sluggishly, as if burdened by the hush of the land below. Snow fell in uneven flurries across the barren expanse, covering old tracks and footprints, building ghostly drifts against abandoned watchposts that clung to the edges of the war-torn countryside. Anyone roaming these wilds would notice how the air itself shivered, thick with an unspoken secret. Something was stirring, something older than any kingdom, and that something was beginning to awaken with an ancient purpose. Beneath the gray sky, a lone figure trudged through knee-deep snow. The figure's cloak was made of coarse wool, patched in places and damp at the hem. The hood, lined with scraps of fur, concealed most of the face, but not the weary eyes peering out. The traveler pressed onward, pausing occasionally to steady shaking fingers around the worn leather hilt of a short sword. There was no hurry in the pace, only grim determination. From a distance, the figure might seem half-ghost, emerging and disappearing in the pale swirl of falling snow. There was a hush everywhere along the edge of the haunted forest to the north. Thick trunks of ancient trees rose like dark pillars, their roots gnarly and twisted, anchoring the secrets of centuries in the frozen ground. The old song spoke of strange shapes that lived among those trunks, watchers that rarely ventured out from the shadows. Most men believed these watchers to be the stuff of stories, children of the forest who had long since vanished. Yet there were rumors whispered over cups of ale, rumors that they had never truly left, only hidden, only biding their time. The traveler, bowing head to shield against the whirling flakes, emerged from a tangle of shrubs onto higher ground. Through a gap in the tree line, the wall came into hazy view. Even at a distance, its colossal height made it unmistakable. A great barrier of ice spanning the horizon from east to west, an impossible testament to men's defiance. The top of that glacial fortress disappeared into the low-hanging sky. Its presence radiated cold and authority, as though it were an unassailable boundary separating the known from the unknown. Even the wind sounded more urgent near the wall, as if it too recognized the power of that ancient work. But on this day, the traveler felt none of the old reassurance. That intangible gloom pressing against the senses wasn't just the stale chill of winter. It was an omen, a sense that centuries of stability, however fraught with small wars and larger betrayals, were trembling at the edges. The traveler wanted to turn back, to bury the feeling of doom beneath mundane errands and quiet nights. Yet something drew the figure onward, along a hidden path that stretched across the snowdrifts. An old ranger's track, rarely used, but still faintly visible to a careful eye. Not far from the traveler's silent march, a small party of Night's Watch recruits hurried through the woods, black cloaks fluttering. Their voices, subdued by the snow, carried faintly on the wind. Each was an uneasy volunteer, or a forced penitent paying a debt to the realm. They did not yet know the wall, the way older rangers did. They spoke of fleeting shapes and odd noises from the forest. Usually, such talk would be dismissed as jitters. Not now. Not with the forest steeped in such a stillness, as if the old weirwoods themselves were eavesdropping. One of them, a gangly youth with reddened cheeks, insisted he saw eyes peering from behind the trunk of a dying oak. The others scoffed, but their laughter was brittle, fragile. Even they could feel some presence lingering just out of sight. The children of the forest, if any remained, were said to have eyes of uncanny color and quick, silent feet that left no tracks. They once shaped the land with magic too old for men to name. They were part of the tapestry of legends, tied to the first men, to the creation of the White Walkers, to the forging of alliances older than any living memory. And though many believed them extinct, there was a stirring in the deeper hollows of that forest, a ripple in the old magic. In hidden glades lit by luminous moss, they gathered in hushed circles, small figures draped in living bark, hair braided with leaves and twigs. The forest floor pulsed under their slender hands, and in their huge, reflective eyes shone determination tempered by sorrow. Near the base of the wall, in a battered outpost never meant to be a permanent camp, a few black-cloaked stewards worked to chop wood for fires. The fires gave fleeting warmth, though it soon lost to the unyielding cold. One steward coughed into his gloves, his breath escaping in frantic puffs. Another sat hunched, fumbling with a worn piece of parchment that supposedly offered a route for supply lines. The supply lines were always dangerously thin, and with winter's deepening hold, fewer caravans risked the journey. So they lingered in place, half frozen, eyes darting toward the silent fortress of ice that towered behind them. Some dreaded the endless watch, longing for release from their vows, while others found an odd camaraderie in the shared hardship. High above, a gust of wind howled across the upper ramparts, swirling thin layers of drifting snow over the edge. Dark silhouettes of ravens perched along the parapets, ruffling their feathers as they scanned the white emptiness below. The occasional caw broke the profound silence, echoing across the glacial surface. To the men on watch, those distant caws felt like warnings. Something out there was watching them too. Something waiting. Far in the distance, the traveler approached the looming shape of a half-collapsed watchtower near the forest's fringe. The structure had been built against the uneven slope centuries ago. Now, frost had pried open the mortar, leaving cracks that snaked up the walls like creeping vines. A rickety door sagged on rusted hinges, screeching when the traveler pushed it open. Inside, the space was cramped, the floor littered with debris from the tower's slow decay. Ice-laden beams shuddered overhead, but it would be shelter enough from the biting wind. The traveler lowered the hood, revealing a face worn by cold and faintly lined with scars. A woman, perhaps in her middle years. Though hunger and the relentless elements gave her features a harder edge, she sank to her knees with a grimace. Her name was Mara. Once, she had tended the ravens at Castle Black, before rumors of rebellion, before wildling raids, and before the tension between men and the unknown grew too thick. She had left under cover of night, compelled by half-understood dreams, and a longing she could not name. Her dreams showed the forest pulsing with emerald light, and strange shapes gliding between the roots. She had awakened haunted, sensing her destiny lay beyond the walls of men. Leaning back against the crumbling stones, she let out a shaking breath. She had traveled for days, half lost, uncertain of her course. But she kept seeing images flicker behind her eyelids whenever she rested. A glimpse of small figures with bark-like skin and eyes bright as moonlight, beckoning her deeper into the forest. It was insane, chasing a dream, chasing legends. Yet she felt that if she turned back now, something monumental would be lost. Perhaps all the 7 kingdoms were in the grip of some larger shift, and though she had never considered herself a hero, she felt pulled toward some role that was not yet clear. Night began to settle. The sun, if it could be called that in the pale winter sky, sank behind the twisted treetops. Long shadows spilled across the snow. Mara peered through the fractured doorway, watching the last bands of light vanish. In that moment, she recalled standing atop the wall years ago, the entire north unfolding before her eyes, trees merging into a dark sea. The wind had been cold, but less oppressive. She remembered feeling hope. Now, the darkness pressed in from every side, and the cold bit deeper. Still, she was no stranger to fear, nor to nights spent alone. She pulled a bit of jerky from her pouch, forcing herself to chew slowly. Each bite grounded her, reminded her she was alive. Away from her small sanctuary, the forest seemed to stir. Snow began to fall more heavily, each flake building upon the next, muting every sound. And then faintly, a rustle. To untrained ears, it would be nothing. But to one who spent time in the wild, it was a whisper of movement, a presence that glided between the trees without cracking a twig or crunching a drift. It came nearer to the old watchtower, pausing within the gloom beneath the boughs, as if curious. Had Mara been outside, she might have glimpsed 2 eyes, green as fresh leaves, reflecting the last scrap of twilight, before blinking out of view. Within the tower, Mara's exhausted mind drifted toward half-sleep. She was suddenly seized by a vision. The wall as it once was, newly raised, men cheering at its power. Then, a swirl of shadows, as if centuries blew away in a single gust. She saw a ring of small figures, eyes shining under ancient weirwood branches. She sensed a pulsing energy that stretched through the roots of the land itself. Then, with a tremendous roar, she saw cracks racing through the mighty wall, shards of ice cascading as if the entire structure were being devoured from within by a primal force. The vision vanished, leaving her gasping in the cold darkness. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she felt sweat trickling down her temples, despite the chill. She thought of the old stories, how the children's magic had once shaped the neck, flooding lands to halt advancing armies of men, how they sang to the weirwoods for guidance, how they had forged alliances that ended the long night. If it was true, if they still lived, and if that power remained, what could possibly stir them to action now? Was it a threat greater than the White Walkers, or something older still? She struggled to steady her breathing, feeling the echo of that vision throbbing behind her eyes. Night deepened, and somewhere in that silent expanse, a soft cry echoed. It was neither human nor animal. A sound like wind chimes in a breeze, carrying notes of sorrow and determination. If any living man heard it, he might have dismissed it as the wind. But it was the call of the children to one another. They moved beneath old trees, passing signals in their strange melodic tongue. A handful of them gathered at the base of a weirwood whose trunk had split centuries ago, giving it a mouth-like gap. Their luminous eyes flickered with urgency as they exchanged glances and gestures. Snow clung to their slender limbs, but they seemed unaffected by the cold, as if the forest itself protected them. One by one they placed small hands against the weirwood's bark, as though communing with something alive within. The wind rose, swirling around them in tiny cyclones of snow. They were preparing for something. An ancient plan carried across the centuries by oral tradition and hidden runes. No songs of men told this tale. It was a last resort, a final measure to reshape the balance of power and reclaim the land from the slow poison that had spread since men first built their castles and roads. They sought to harness that old magic again. And the wall, that monolithic symbol of separation, was at the center of it. They believed the time had come, though whether driven by desperation or cunning, none but they could say. Their eyes gleamed in silent agreement. The wind quieted once more, as if in deference to what was about to begin. Mara awoke before dawn. She sensed she wasn't alone. Slowly, she pulled herself to her feet. Fingers clutched around her short sword's hilt. The darkness outside the watchtower was nearly impenetrable. She crept to a narrow slit in the wall, her breath shallow. She saw nothing at first, only gently drifting snow. Then, movement. A small figure, childlike in height, but somehow timeless, peered around a broken wall. Mara froze, heart pounding. She dared not move or speak. The figure's face was obscured by drifting shadows, but she glimpsed an outline that made her blood run cold and hot all at once. Could it truly be? Time stretched. The figure retreated, leaving only silence in its wake. Mara waited, uncertain if she should follow. Her entire life, she had considered the children a fairy tale. But her dream had hinted otherwise. She had read accounts in the old libraries, stories of men stumbling upon them and living to tell the tale, stories of alliances long past. Now, that battered watchtower might be the threshold of some new legend. Gathering her courage, she slid the sword back into its scabbard, took a step toward the doorway, and felt the chill wind whip her face as she emerged once more into the pre-dawn gloom. Clumps of snow rained down from the skeletal branches above, landing on her cloak with dull thumps. No footprints marked the ground. She ventured a few steps, scanning the shadows. Nothing. Yet she felt watched, as if 1,000 eyes crouched behind every trunk. The wind moaned, stirring the branches into creaking protests. She wondered if her senses deceived her. Then, as her gaze swept over the nearest stand of pines, she glimpsed a flicker of movement again. This time, she followed. Her boots sank into the drifts, slowing her pace. The figure remained just at the edge of sight, a swift shadow that never let her close the distance, yet never quite vanished. She found herself weaving deeper and deeper into the ancient forest. The undergrowth thickened, forcing her to duck under low branches and sidestep half-buried roots. Her breath came in quick gasps, clouding the air. Still, the figure beckoned her onward, leaving only hints of motion or the sway of a branch in its wake. She knew it might be a trap, that she might be chasing nothing but illusions. Yet some force of will compelled her to continue. an inner voice urging her forward. Time lost its meaning in that silent pursuit. The forest canopy above was so thick in places that the sky disappeared, replaced by the dark network of branches laced with ice. Finally, the figure halted near a wide clearing lined with drooping pines. A hush enveloped the glade. Almost reverent, cautiously, Mara approached the edge. The figure was there, small and lithe, skin the color of wood, hair interwoven with leaves, and a few braided feathers. Large eyes regarded her with neither fear nor hostility. Another shape emerged behind the first, similarly small and strange. Then a third. Mara swallowed, uncertain whether to speak. Her heart pounded as she realized the stories were true. The children of the forest still existed, somehow. She wondered how many more hid in the darkness. Silence stretched. Then one stepped closer. It extended a slender hand with web-like fingers. It was a gesture that did not feel threatening. Mara hesitated, reached out trembling fingers, and gently touched that outstretched hand. A sudden rush of cold and warmth together rippled through her body, as if an entire current of memory and feeling flowed between them. She gasped and nearly fell to her knees, tears forming in her eyes. It was as though in that single touch, she experienced echoes of their ancient sorrow and fierce hope. She saw glimpses of weirwood networks, of subterranean caverns where crystals sang in the dark, of battles waged in primeval nights, of heartbreak at the encroachment of men, of a wound inflicted on the land itself by hubris and war. Then it faded, leaving her panting for breath. The small figure withdrew its hand, the glow in its eyes dimming somewhat. Another of the children stepped forward, studying Mara's every feature. Mara did not move. She sensed their curiosity. And something else. Expectation. She mustered her courage and said, voice quivering, "Why have you called me here?" The whisper of her words lingered, but she heard no response. Instead, one of them gestured to the clearing's center. Puzzled, Mara slowly turned. At the clearing's heart grew a wide weirwood, its trunk contorted, the face carved long ago now, almost lost beneath moss and lichen. Pale bark glowed faintly in the early gloom. Roots emerged from the snow like serpents, twisting around a ring of stones that marked an ancient ritual site. Mara felt drawn forward, as if carried by a soft wind. The children followed behind, their silent steps leaving only the faintest trace upon the snow. Upon reaching the weirwood, Mara noticed old markings in the wood, swirling lines that intersected near where the eyes would be. She dared to place her palm against it. The bark was cold, but a pulsing energy lay beneath the surface, reminiscent of a heartbeat. She caught the faint hum of some primordial song, like water trickling through distant caverns. The presence of the children was close now, and she dared not turn away from the tree. She sensed them forming a circle around her. It was as though they were inviting her to share in something older than all the kingdoms, older than men's sense of time. One of the children began to speak in a language that didn't quite register as words. It was a gentle, melodic chant that resonated within Mara's chest. The sound swelled, joined by others, rising in eerie harmony. She felt her surroundings shift, or rather, her perception of them. The forest grew dim around the edges, and the weirwood's face seemed to breathe. A series of images formed in her mind unbidden. The white walkers prowling the land, the wall standing like a barrier of pure ice, a conflict roiling beneath the surface of the world. She sensed a swirl of conflicting powers. The magic of men, the cold might of the undead, and the ancient wrath of the children, awakened by centuries of betrayal and fear. She couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. The chanting pressed in on her from all sides, filling her ears with an otherworldly melody. Another wave of visions struck her. She saw the moment of the wall's creation, ice being coaxed upwards by sorcery lost to time. The very land altering its shape to forge that barrier. She saw armies arrayed on both sides, men, giants, and the children themselves. Then the visions leapt across the span of centuries, flickering through the slow unraveling of trust. The secret pacts broken, the guilt and sorrow etched into those small, ancient faces. Finally, she saw a gathering of the children in hidden hollows, planning a monumental act, the undoing of Wall's foundation. Tears streamed down her face. She understood on some primal level that they believed this act necessary, not out of pure malice or vengeance, but from a desperation to restore the natural flow of magic and life across the land. The wall was an artifact of men's might, yes, but it also had come to represent a wound in the land's soul, an unnatural partition that stifled the deeper currents of power. She felt their anxiety too. The White Walkers were but one aspect of the threat. The greater terror was that men's wars and expansions had chipped away at the old wards, unraveling the delicate balance that once existed. The children sought to reclaim their place in the world, to let the old powers run free again, no matter the cost. When the chanting finally receded, Mara staggered backward, breath hitching in her throat. She glanced around at the circle of watchers, her mind reeling with the magnitude of what she had witnessed. One of them, the one who first touched her, stepped forward again. This time, it spoke a few halting words in the common tongue. The voice was soft, like leaves trembling in a breeze. You? Help? Or no? She realized they were asking for her decision, her willingness to align with them in this terrifying, world-shaping event. She didn't know how to respond. She remembered the men of the Night's Watch, their vow to guard the realms of men, to stand resolute against threats from the north. She remembered the few companions she still cared for, the unspoken love she carried for her once brother, still manning his post on the wall perhaps. Destroying the wall would leave men vulnerable to the horrors beyond. Yet her vision showed that the children believed the deeper magic demanded such destruction, that the barriers keeping the land sundered were leading to an even greater catastrophe. An internal war waged in her heart. Her voice trembled as she managed, "I don't understand." The child that had spoken simply cocked its head. Another spoke, voice like a soft echo. The wound must heal. The ice must break. Their archaic grammar made the message starker. Mara shuddered. Could she refuse? Could she, a mere wanderer, stand against their ancient purpose? Did she have a duty to warn the Night's Watch? She glanced around at them, seeing no malice in their luminous eyes, but neither did she see mercy. They were acting as caretakers of this world in their own way, bound to the land. They had once allied with the First Men. The question was whether the old alliances were truly undone, or if some new pact might be forged. Before she could form another word, the clearing filled with a whispering wind. The children exchanged knowing glances. A new shape emerged from the darkness of the trees. It was taller than the others, perhaps a leader or elder. Its hair glimmered with strands of silver in the faint light, and its eyes held an even deeper understanding. Mara stared, a prickling sense of awe lifting the hair on her arms. This one radiated power, an authority that transcended speech. With a subtle gesture, it beckoned Mara closer. She hesitated, feeling fear coil in her stomach, but something guided her feet forward until she was within a stride of this figure. She noticed the swirling patterns on its bark-like skin, resembling the weirwood markings, the same swirling lines from her dream. It raised a hand and pressed a thumb to the center of her forehead. She gasped as warmth flooded her mind. Another wave of visions, more vivid this time, threatened to overwhelm her. She saw the forging of a new dawn, a world where the boundaries of men and magic were redefined. The wall that had stood for thousands of years, undone in a surge of power that radiated from the old god's roots. She heard echoes of men's cries, saw the swirling shapes of ice and snow break apart, felt the ground shake. She cried out, staggering back as the elder child lowered its hand. The chanting began anew, softer this time, a low murmur that seemed to come from the stones, the trees, even the air. Mara sank to her knees, tears in her eyes. Everything she believed was in question. Duty, loyalty, survival. And yet, she sensed something resonant in the children's urgency, a necessity to align the world with its natural currents once more. Slowly, she bowed her head, acknowledging that she did not have the power to stand against them, nor the will to turn away. She gave the faintest nod, whether it was acceptance or resignation. Even she could not say. The circle around her opened. The wind died away, leaving a profound stillness. Snow drifted gently through the clearing. One by one, the children faded back into the shadows, except for the elder, who continued to watch Mara with an inscrutable gaze. Finally, it too turned and disappeared among the trees. Mara found herself alone, kneeling at the base of the weirwood. Her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. She yearned to run back to the wall, to warn someone, to do something. But the memory of that chant, the sense of inevitability, weighted her limbs like lead. She stayed there for what felt like hours, letting the forest slowly come back into focus. Birds rustled overhead, pecking at hidden seeds in the snow. Squirrels chittered. Life went on in quiet rhythms. The hush of the glade felt both peaceful and solemn. Eventually, the sky brightened slightly, indicating dawn's approach, though the sun was still veiled behind swaths of cloud. Mara rose on shaky legs, supporting herself against the weirwood's trunk for balance. She had no illusions that the children had spared her out of kindness. They had used her as a conduit, a messenger, or perhaps a pawn in an age-old game. What now? She cast one final glance at the solemn face carved into the tree before she turned to retrace her steps. Her footsteps felt heavier than before. She realized she might never again see the wall as simply a barrier of ice. Now, she saw it as a dam holding back the old powers. Whether that was good or ill was tangled in centuries of conflict. She picked her way back through the forest, guided by whatever faint sense of direction she still possessed. The old watchtower lay somewhere behind her, but she hardly cared about it now. Her thoughts circled around the question that loomed in her mind. How long until the children carried out their plan? As she walked, she tried to gather her swirling thoughts. She had glimpsed a circle of power, of magic older than men's memory, yet the wall was defended by spells of its own, woven by the first builders, rumored to have the blessing of the old gods and the might of the Starks. Could the children truly unravel such a formidable creation? Perhaps they had no certainty themselves, only a calculated hope. The notion filled her with dread. If the children succeeded, the realm would be exposed to whatever horrors lurked in the far north. If they failed, it might unleash consequences just as dire, magical ripples affecting the entire land. She felt the weight of choices she scarcely understood. She could continue to Castle Black, share what she had learned, risk being named a madwoman, or worse. Men had never proven particularly open to rumors of the children's reemergence. Or she could vanish, trying to outrun the events she had seen. But something told her there was no outrunning this. The memory of those small, solemn faces and the swirl of energy beneath her palm at the weirwood left a mark on her soul. For better or for worse, she was part of it now. Uncertain how much time had passed, she pressed on until the trees thinned. The sky opened above her, revealing the distant form of the wall again. She paused at the tree line. There it stood, immense, cutting across the land, a symbol of men's resilience and pride. She spotted the dark silhouettes of watchtowers spaced along its heights. Even in the weak dawnlight, the ice walls glistened with a bluish sheen. She wondered how many men stood guard right now, how many had families south of the region, how many were criminals who never dreamed they'd be at the center of a cosmic shift. A twinge of sorrow pricked her. They had no idea what was coming. Mara pressed a hand to her forehead, recalling the elder child's touch. She felt a lingering echo, as if a part of that magic now dwelled within her. She drew a shaky breath, then forced herself forward, leaving the sanctuary of the forest. The wind picked up across the open expanse, lashing at her cheeks. She trudged onward, every step reminding her of the question. Should she warn them? Should she keep silent? The dreamlike haze of the clearing still weighed on her mind, but she knew she had to decide soon. After a while, she spotted signs of life. A pair of black-cloaked men circled a small outer camp, a thin thread of smoke rising from a makeshift fire. They spotted her in turn. One hefted a crossbow, shouting for her to halt. She raised her hands, showing she held no weapon. They came closer, eyes wary, scanning her for threats. "Who goes there?" demanded the taller one, adjusting his fur hood. "Mara," she answered, voice hoarse. I served at Castle Black once, in the rookery." The two exchanged puzzled looks. The one with the crossbow pointed at her. "You're far from Castle Black, friend. Where'd you come from?" His tone was suspicious but tempered by curiosity. A lone woman in a battered cloak, stumbling from the deep forest at dawn, was a sight that demanded explanation. She opened her mouth to speak, hesitated. What could she say? That she had just communed with the children of the forest, who planned to tear down the wall with ancient magic. They would likely laugh or arrest her for madness. She swallowed, finally managing. "I got lost, looking for shelter." They eyed her, taking in her ragged state. The second man, younger, softened his posture. "Come on, we'll get you some warmth. Name's Bannon, this is Will." He gestured toward the camp, a pitiful gathering of tents half buried in snow. "We're waiting for a supply run that's overdue. Might be a while." "Now where?" Mara nodded, trailing after them. She could almost feel the presence of the children at her back, urging her to remain silent, to keep their secret. Yet she also felt the ghosts of those old vows echoing in her conscience, the shield that guards the realms of men. Her stomach twisted. She had no appetite for this burden, yet it was hers now. She slumped down by the meager fire they had built, extending her numb fingers to the heat. Will kept his crossbow within easy reach, but the tension eased as he saw how exhausted she was. Bannon handed her a battered flask with some ale. She sipped, letting the liquid warm her belly. They asked simple questions: where she was from, how she survived out there. She offered half-truths. She'd once been part of the Watch support staff, left on a supply mission that went awry, got turned around in the storm. They seemed to accept it for now. As day struggled to lighten the gray sky, more black-cloaked figures emerged from the tents. They eyed Mara with curiosity. She forced small smiles, answering their cautious greetings. All around, she saw men barely surviving, huddled close to their fires. Some looked desperate, eyes sunken from lack of food or sleep. A few had frostbitten fingertips, hands heavily bandaged. This was the real face of the Watch, not proud knights, but misfits and lost souls scraping by at the edge of the world. Mara felt an ache in her chest. Could she condemn them to the fury of whatever lurked beyond, by not warning them of the children's plan? On the other hand, if the children believed the wall's fall was necessary to restore balance, could she stand in the path of that ancient magic? Perhaps men had sowed the seeds of their own undoing, she thought bitterly. She spent the day resting among them, listening to their conversations. Most talked about petty daily struggles, scrounging for food, the tedium of the Watch, rumors of wildlings. One or two mentioned a sense of unease, that the forest was too quiet. A wiry fellow claimed he heard something singing at night, but the others dismissed him. Mara knew precisely what he meant and felt a cold pit in her stomach. The children moved swiftly in their preparations, she suspected. Each day might bring them closer to the appointed hour. As evening approached, a grizzled ranger named Tyvar returned from a patrol, shaking snow from his boots. He seemed troubled. When pressed, he said he'd seen lights flickering deep in the woods, greenish glows that disappeared when he tried to approach. The men joked it must be ghosts or swamp gas. Tyvar responded with a sour look, pouring himself a cup of thin broth. Mara noticed how his eyes darted to her, as though suspecting she knew more than she let on. She turned away, feigning ignorance, but her heart pounded. Throughout that second night, she slept fitfully, if at all. She huddled near the fire, senses alert to every sound in the darkness. Memories of the chanting drifted through her mind, the swirling lines carved into living wood, the pulse of magic ready to burst forth. She recalled how the children had asked for her help, or at least her complicity. She had not chosen words, only a nod that felt more like surrender. At dawn's faint arrival, she rose, determined to reach Castle Black proper. If there was any place to speak of these matters, it might be there. Even though she doubted the new leadership would believe her, she found Bannon packing a small rucksack. "We're heading back to the castle soon," he said. "If the supply run isn't coming to us, maybe we should find it ourselves." He paused, glancing at her uncertainly. "You look pale. You sure you're all right?" She mustered a reassuring smile. "Just weary. Traveling in the cold. I'll be fine." He nodded, and continued his preparations. In truth, she felt a tangle of fear and obligation. Telling them was a risk, but so was silence. Perhaps she could speak with Maester Harmond in private. The old man had always been open-minded about lore and history. If she could confide in him, maybe he would at least listen. They set off a short while later, a group of 6 men plus Mara, trudging across the snowy plains. The wall loomed closer with each step, its formidable presence dominating the horizon. The swirling wind carried flecks of snow that stung their faces. Bannon, leading the group, kept his gaze fixed forward, scanning for any sign of movement. Will grumbled about the cold, hands clenching his crossbow nervously. The others trudged in silence. Mara walked at the rear, head bowed. She could not help imagining what it might look like if the wall fell. Vast sheets of ice splitting, tumbling down in monstrous cascades, the ground shaking. Would it happen at once, or in sections? Would the magic unravel slowly, or in a single catastrophic moment? Her mind swam with possibilities. Hours passed. The morning sky gave way to midday gloom. At last they arrived at one of the great gates, manned by the watchman who had the miserable job of guard duty. The gate's portcullis was lifted after some terse calls, and the group filed inside. Within, the courtyard bustled with a subdued sort of life. Horses whinnied, blacksmiths hammered, men milled about with battered equipment. Smoke from cook fires curled into the sky. Seeing it filled Mara with a pang of nostalgia. She had spent many hours at Castle Black, caring for ravens, patching up injuries, eavesdropping on the rangers' tales. Though it was a rough place, it had been her home. Now she was a stranger here, returning with secrets that could shatter everything. She followed the others into the courtyard, ignoring the curious stares. She caught sight of a couple of officers conferring near the armory, rosters in hand. She recognized the older one, Sir Elland, a knight once known for his fair judgment. He looked more harried than she remembered. As they approached, he turned to greet them, wanting a report on the missing supply. Bannon and Will began their account, describing the thin conditions and the sense of foreboding in the forests. Mara hung back, letting them talk. Her gaze drifted to the high walkways, to the ravens perched in neat rows near the rookery. For a fleeting moment, she thought of going straight there to speak with Maester Harmond. Then she saw him, crossing the yard with the help of a gnarled walking stick. Time had added more wrinkles to his brow, but his eyes were sharp as ever. She excused herself from the group and hurried over, feeling the chill in her limbs, replaced by a rush of anxious determination. He blinked in surprise at the sight of her, almost dropping a stack of scrolls. "Mara? By the old gods, is that truly you?" His voice carried a raspy warmth. "I thought you'd gone south or vanished." He scanned her face, concern evident. "What are you doing here, child?" She tried to form the words, but they stuck in her throat. The busy courtyard pressed in around them. Men jostled by, some leading horses, others dragging crates. Too many ears. She lowered her voice. "Maester, I need to speak with you, privately. It's urgent." He studied her a moment, then nodded. "Come, to my chambers." Her relief was palpable. She fell into step beside him, ignoring the curious glances of passers-by. They wound through corridors carved into the base of the ancient keep, passing flickering torches set in iron sconces. The castle smelled of damp stone, straw, and old fires, as it always had. Eventually, they reached a small chamber piled with books, scrolls, and half-finished parchments. Harmond closed the door behind them and gestured for her to sit on a stool near the lone window. He cleared a pile of dusty tomes from a chair and sat facing her, leaning on his stick. "Now," he said gently, "tell me everything." Mara exhaled, feeling the weight of the past days crush in on her. She began, hesitantly at first, describing her dream, the impulse that drove her into the forest, the encounter with the children of the forest. As she spoke, the maester's eyes widened. He leaned forward, hanging on to her every word, expressions shifting from disbelief to fascination to fear. She recounted the circle beneath the weirwood, the chanting, the visions of the wall collapsing. Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. Finally she finished, breathing hard, her face flushed. Silence settled over the cramped room, broken only by the crackle of a torch in the corridor. The old maester steepled his fingers, expression grave. "The children of the forest. You say you actually saw them, touched them?" She nodded. "And they intend to bring down the wall using their oldest magics, to heal a wound they believe men caused?" She nodded again, tears threatening to escape. "Dear gods," he murmured, turning to gaze at the swirl of falling snow visible through the window. "If what you say is true, this changes everything." She felt relief that he at least believed her. But what could he do? Who in power would listen? The Lord's commander over the centuries had faced wildling invasions, White Walkers, betrayal within the ranks, but never the idea that the children themselves might rise to destroy the very foundation of the realm's northern defense. Harmon rubbed his brow. "We must think carefully. If word spreads, panic will ensue. Many would question your sanity, or worse, accuse you of treason." Mara understood. She bowed her head, tears slipping free. "I don't want to cause ruin. But I can't remain silent. I was pulled into their circle. I've seen it. They said the ice must break. Is there a way to stop this?" He sighed, leaning heavily on his walking stick. Old alliances once bound men and the children. If such an alliance could be renewed, perhaps a compromise could be reached. But that was thousands of years ago. The children you met, they do not seem interested in negotiation. Perhaps they believe time for talk has passed. "Aye." Mara recalled the determined faces in the clearing, the chanting that resonated through the weirwood's roots. She felt certain they would not be swayed by men's pleas. They had found a cause in the land's pain. Something intangible, but powerful. She shivered at the memory. The maester's words sank heavily into her heart. He rose, retrieving a heavy tome from a cluttered shelf. Dust plumed as he opened it, revealing pages filled with archaic script and diagrams of runic symbols. There is lore here, from the Age of Heroes. Accounts that mention cooperation with the children. Something about a place, a hidden grove. Possibly an ancient meeting ground. He flipped pages with trembling fingers. If we could reach such a place, if it even still exists, maybe we could speak with them. He trailed off, shaking his head. It's a slim hope, but perhaps better than nothing. Mara took a steadying breath. I can't face them alone again. I barely survived the last time. Her eyes shone with fear and a strange resolve. We need someone who can talk sense. Someone they might recognize as an ally of the old gods. Harmon set the tome aside, lifting his gaze to her. We'll need to tread carefully. The realm is fractious, and the Night's Watch isn't exactly flush with people who believe in diplomacy with legends. She nodded, letting the statement hang in the chilly air. Both knew time was precarious. The children were gathering power, and the wall loomed outside, unsuspecting. One day soon, it might stand no longer. Silence settled between them like a veil, heavy with unspoken dread and fragile hope. A.K.N.T. Mara stood in the cramped space of Maester Harmon's chamber, her heart pounding in the hush that followed their exchange. The crackle of a torch in the hallway was the only sound for a long moment. Around them, the stacked shelves and leaning towers of books seemed to loom closer, holding centuries of dusty knowledge that might hold only fragments of what they truly needed. She could still feel the echo of that voice. Soft, melodic, inhuman, resonating in her thoughts. The memory made her skin prickle with equal parts awe and dread. Harmon's knuckles drummed on the spine of the weathered tome he'd taken out, the rhythmic tapping betraying his own tension. He was an old man who had seen many winters. Deep lines etched his forehead, and behind his keen eyes flickered an uncharacteristic uncertainty. She recalled when she was but a girl, tasked with bringing him trays of food while he pored over maps and manuscripts. He had always seemed so assured in his knowledge, so calm in the face of mysteries. Yet now, in the face of this, his composure showed cracks. He held the book open, scanning more pages, brow furrowed. "Here," he murmured, lifting a bony finger to trace a faded illustration. Long ago, before the wall was completed, the children met with the first men in groves of weirwoods to negotiate. According to legend, A few such groves became sacred neutral ground. He paused, lips pursed. One such place was rumored to be near a hidden river fork to the far west of the Frostfangs. If it still stands, it may be the only place that I'd consider. Parley. She let the word hang in her mind. Parley.wool. It hinted at a possibility of conversation, an alternative to cataclysm. Though the child who had touched her mind seemed to burn with conviction, perhaps not all shared that fervor. Or perhaps they might listen to a different voice, a plea for cooperation. She hugged her arms around herself, thinking of the immense risk such a journey would pose. The Frostfangs were wild country even in the best of times, filled with dangerous terrain and, in winter, all but impossible. Yet she felt no choice. If there was a chance to avert a disaster, perhaps even a small one, she had to try. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice thin and tired. Harmon closed the book with a sigh. A swirl of dust rose and caught the torchlight. "First, we must be sure. Tread softly. Gather information. There's a possibility that the children are already gathering at some secret site. If so, perhaps that site itself is the place they plan to harness magic powerful enough to crack the wall." His jaw tightened. "We cannot barge in unprepared. We need someone who can navigate not just the forest, but the knowledge of the old gods. Someone the children might not immediately reject." He looked up at her with an odd light in his eyes. "Someone they've already touched." Her stomach clenched. "Me." There was no need for him to confirm it. She knew the moment he looked at her with that quiet intensity. She was the one who had been chosen, by chance or fate, when she'd stumbled upon their circle and survived. "But I can't do it alone," she said, aware of how her voice trembled, despite her attempts to appear resolute. The memory of the children's circle still felt like a cold brand on her consciousness. The idea of seeking them out again, intentionally, felt like trying to hold a flame in her bare hands. He nodded. "We'll find a companion or two. Someone we trust." He glanced at the door, as though worried someone might be listening. In a lower voice he continued, "But we must keep this quiet, or the panic could be worse than the threat itself. You know how easily men's fears can be stirred. Tales of the wall's destruction. It would not go over well." She thought of the men she'd met just that morning. Bannon, Will, Tyvar, and the others. All of them clinging to the watch routine. Some barely believed in the White Walkers, let alone the children. If she stood in the courtyard and shouted a warning of magic older than men's histories, of a planned demolition of the wall, few would hesitate to call her mad. Even if they believed, the prospect of losing that final shield might send them all into a frenzy. "We have to do something," she whispered, pressing a hand to her forehead as though to stifle a sudden throb of pain. "Time is running out. I can feel it. Even now, I feel echoes. As if they're summoning their power." The old maester's gaze flicked to her hand, then back to her eyes. "It's possible," he said carefully. "Their magic flows through the weirwoods. If you came into contact with that network, if you truly have a link to it, there may be echoes." He sighed again, weariness in every line of his face. "I must see if I can glean more from these texts. Meanwhile, you must eat and rest. You're in no condition to wander the castle halls all day." A surge of gratitude mingled with her dread. In that moment, it felt good to have someone who believed her, someone who cared for her well-being, even if the tasks ahead loomed as large and cold as the wall itself. She rose unsteadily, her legs stiff from tension. "I'll go to the kitchens," she murmured. "Try to find some bread, maybe some soup. Do you need anything, Maester?" He waved a hand. No, just come back tonight. We'll talk more then." His gaze lingered on her. "Be cautious who you speak with. Choose your words wisely. We still don't know who might be friend or foe in such a predicament." She understood. Each step beyond this door was a step among men, who might never accept that the children of the forest walked among them again, and threatened to undo what men had held sacred for millennia. She slipped out, stepping into the cold corridor lit by sputtering torches. The castle's heartbeat thudded around her, men's voices echoing from the great hall. The distant clang of a hammer on an anvil in the forge, the whistle of wind rushing through gaps in the aging ramparts. Her mind churned with thoughts as she made her way to the kitchens. The passageways wound around gloomily, with bare stone walls that seemed to close in on her. Familiar corners recalled simpler times. A younger Mara carrying stacks of linen, or bringing scraps to the stable dogs. How long ago that felt now. At the mouth of the kitchens, the smell of baking bread and simmering stew welcomed her. A few stewards bustled about, stirring pots or sorting through sacks of grain. She nodded politely, fetching a bowl of the thin stew from a grizzled cook, who eyed her suspiciously but didn't comment. She found a corner bench and settled, letting the warmth of the bowl seep into her hands. She was painfully hungry, but found each mouthful of stew awkward to swallow. Her senses remained on high alert, straining to pick up any hint that someone might notice her agitation or read the secrets in her eyes. It took her a few minutes to finish, and each minute felt like an eternity. By the time she scraped the last bit of stew from the bowl, her heartbeat still hammered with worry. She returned the bowl, thanked the cook softly, and slipped back into the corridors. She wound through the courtyard, noting the steady flow of men going about their duties. Archers repaired bowstrings. Stable hands brushed down the shaggy garrons used for northern patrols. Black-clad recruits practiced sword strokes under the watchful eye of a scarred veteran. A sparring bout drew a small crowd, and she paused for a moment to watch. The clash of steel on steel felt distant, as though the real conflict loomed elsewhere, unseen by all these unsuspecting watchers. A presence at her shoulder startled her. She turned to see Will, the crossbowman she'd met at the campsite, standing there. He wore a curious expression, brow furrowed in puzzlement. "Didn't know you were still around," he said, voice quiet as though not wanting to draw attention. "Looked for you earlier, but you were gone." She tried to keep her tone casual. "Needed to see the maester," she said. I've been away from the castle for a while. Had some old injuries that needed tending." It was half truth, half deflection. She didn't want to seem rude, but the tension in her chest coiled tighter at the sight of him. If he pressed with more questions, she'd have to lie, or risk sounding mad. He nodded, shifting his weight. Snow clung to the edges of his black cloak. "I see. Well, you gave me a strange feeling back at camp. You seemed spooked." He glanced around. All of that talk about the forest being too quiet. Tivar's mention of lights. "You were real quiet when we asked you about it." Her throat constricted. She offered a thin smile. "I was tired," she managed, trying not to let the unease seep into her voice. "And, truth be told, the forest does spook me. I saw things out there that, well, maybe the mind plays tricks." "Nay." He watched her carefully for a moment. "Maybe," he said at last, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced. "We're heading out again soon, if the Lord Commander decrees we should send more scouts. Supplies keep getting delayed. Maybe you'll come with us again? You know the woods," so the men said. She forced a polite laugh. "I'm no ranger. I barely got myself here in one piece." She dipped her head to him, stepping away before he could probe further. "Stay safe out there," she offered, then turned and headed toward the rookery's tower, hoping he wouldn't follow. The rookery's entrance was guarded by old wooden doors reinforced with iron bands, and inside, the air was thick with the smell of bird droppings and stale straw. Cages stacked on shelves lined the walls, each containing ravens that shifted restlessly, their feathers black as midnight. The birds croaked in a cacophony of protest at her intrusion. She inhaled deeply, memory pricking at her. She used to tend these very birds, carrying messages from distant lords, or from the watch's scattered outposts. The sound of flapping wings and the fluttering shadows evoked an odd nostalgia. She saw a lean youth, in a steward's cloak tidying the cages, carefully replacing soiled straw and refilling water dishes. He glanced at her. "You need something, mistress." His tone was polite, but wary, as though she might be there to critique his work. She shook her head softly, stepping forward to stroke the head of a raven perched near the edge of its cage. The creature eyed her with bright, beady eyes, let out a singular croak, then settled. "No," she whispered. "Just remembering." Her fingers brushed the cage bars gently. She recalled calmer days, sending routine reports and receiving word from the southern lords, with news that seemed so distant to Castle Black. A time when the threat of the others was but a rumor, and no one had even considered that the children might be stirring in the dark. She withdrew her hand, meeting the youth's questioning look. "Carry on, Wound. You're doing fine." "No." She slipped back out, telling herself she would return once more to the maester after nightfall. For now, she needed space, needed to think. Wandering the courtyard felt risky with so many eyes. Instead, she retreated to an old walkway along the inner wall, a place few visited because it offered no vantage point beyond the yard itself. The parapets were half crumbling, the ramparts covered in wind-blown snow. She climbed the worn steps, emerging onto a narrow platform, open to the swirling cold wind. From here, she could see beyond the walls of Castle Black, across the blank expanse of white that reached toward the looming wall itself. She leaned on the stone parapet, letting the breeze ruffle her hair. The top of the wall soared so high above that the upper ramparts disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. She watched the occasional patrol, a pair of black-clad figures, passing along the distant heights, silhouettes etched against the pale sky. She wondered if the children's magic would come like a sudden thunderclap or a slow trickling away of the wall's essence until it collapsed under its own weight. She closed her eyes and tried to recall the chant, the swirl of voices she had heard in the Weirwood Circle. When she did, she felt an odd buzzing at the back of her skull, as though the memory itself bristled with power. The old gods. She had grown up hearing that the old gods listened through the Weirwood faces. Now she knew the children were tied to that same force. If they were determined, how could any single soul stand against it? She stayed there until her fingers and toes numbed from the cold, lost in those thoughts, fighting the waves of worry that threatened to drag her under. Finally, she forced herself to move, stomping life back into her feet as she descended the steps. The sky had dimmed, and with dusk approaching, the courtyard's bustle faded. Men finished their chores, drifted to the hall for supper, or took posts for the overnight watch. She slipped in among them, nondescript in her patched cloak, heading once more toward Maester Harmon's tower. None gave her more than a passing glance, for which she was grateful. She had no appetite, not after the stew she'd forced herself to eat, and her mind wasn't on supper, but on the conversation ahead. When she pushed open the door to Harmon's chamber, she found him seated at a small table laden with texts unrolled across the surface. A single lantern flickered, casting his lined face in shifting shadows. He looked up at her entrance, nodding curtly. His voice was low, subdued. "Mara. Sit." She shut the door carefully, warding out the chill. "Have you found something?" He ran a hand over his stubbled chin. Hints, fragments, references to a binding magic used in the Age of Heroes. It was a pact, sealed with blood and weirwood sap, ensuring that men and the children would not destroy each other. The same magic might be at play now, but in reverse. If the children see this wall as a symbol of men's betrayal, they may try to break that ancient oath complete. She slumped onto the stool. "Is there anything about stopping them?" He frowned. "Nothing so direct. But it said that if a new pact was made, it could override or reshape the old. Whether that means the wall remains intact, I cannot say." He gestured to a scattering of notes he'd made. "I suspect the only place to attempt such a pact is in one of their sacred groves. Possibly the one near the Frostfangs I mentioned, or a Weirwood grove older still. They choose these sites carefully, the presence of special runic stones, the intersection of ley lines, some manner of conduit for their power." Her mouth was dry. "So we must go west, and soon." He nodded. "Before they muster enough power to strike. But traveling there," he looked grim, "the wildlands are dangerous, especially in this season. We'll face bitter cold, uncertain paths, and the possibility of encountering raiders or worse. And that's assuming we even manage to slip away unnoticed. The Lord Commander has grown cautious of unauthorized excursions. Too many men desert these days." Mara felt a prickle of anxiety at the thought of desertion. The Night's Watch always treated desertion harshly. Yet here, the stakes transcended any vow. Harmon recognized that as well. His uneasy expression said as much. She took a breath. We need at least one or two others, trustworthy and skilled enough to survive the journey. She thought of Bannon, who had seemed more open-minded than some. And Tyver, who was already suspicious. Something was wrong. But did she truly trust them? Harmon set the notes aside. One of our rangers, Kareth, is a believer in the old ways. He prays to the old gods. He's been loyal to the Watch for many years, but he's not blind to the mysteries of the forest. If we confide in him, perhaps he'd come. He paused, glancing at Mara. But we must weigh carefully how much to tell him. Some truths are too large to swallow at once. She recalled Kareth from her time in the rookery. A quiet man, broad-shouldered, with streaks of gray in his hair despite not being that old. He was reputed to have the keenest senses among the rangers, said to see movements in the dark that others missed. She nodded slowly. If you think we can trust him, we should try. Harmon tapped the edge of the table. Then we approach him discreetly. I'll send word for him to come see me. Something about an old wound I need checked. He'll come alone. Then we'll gauge his response. The corners of his mouth twitched in something like a grim smile. If he thinks we've gone mad, well, we'll cross that bridge when we must. They lapsed into silence. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters in the narrow window, a long, low groan sweeping through the corridor. Mara rubbed her arms. I can't stop thinking about them, she admitted softly. The children. When I was among them, I felt it wasn't just fear. It was awe. Like I was standing on the edge of a great chasm, looking down into a depth I couldn't fathom. Harmon studied her. I believe you. The old stories speak of their power in hushed terms. We must hope that there's still room in them for mercy. Their anger might be well earned, but if they no longer share any sympathy for men, then this could spiral into a calamity that engulfs us all. She bent her head, recalling the way the elder child had pressed its thumb to her forehead. The wave of visions that had nearly undone her. In that moment, she had sensed longing and sorrow as much as anger. But how far had that sorrow carried them toward a merciless resolve? She pushed the thought away, forcing her limbs to move. I should get some rest, she said. Let me know when you plan to speak to Kareth. I'll be ready. He gave a weary nod. Yes, rest while you can. She left, letting the door close behind her with a soft thud. The corridors were dimmer now, the torches burning lower. Most men settled in the great hall or their barracks after dark. The gloom lent the old stone passages a lonely, haunted quality. She walked slowly, her eyes tracing the old tapestries, the cracks in the walls. She couldn't escape the feeling that something beneath these stones was trembling, as if the castle itself felt a storm gathering far off. When she reached the small storeroom she'd been given for sleep, a cramped space with a narrow cot and a meager blanket, she slipped inside, barring the door behind her. Shivering in the dark, she lit a single stub of candle, placed it on a tiny table, and unbuckled her belt. The short sword she carried clattered softly to the floor. She sank onto the cot, pulling the blanket around her shoulders as the wind keened outside. For a long time, she stared at the flickering candle flame, wishing she could banish her thoughts to the far corners of her mind, if only for a few hours. Eventually, exhaustion won out. Her eyes drifted shut. She slipped into a restless doze. Her dreams were fractured, filled with glimpses of swirling snow, weirwood faces that bled red sap, small hands reaching out to her. Then she heard the echo of splintering ice, sharp as thunder, reverberating inside her skull. She bolted upright, heart hammering so hard her chest hurt. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The candle had burned low, leaving the room in near darkness. She pressed a hand to her forehead, sweat cooling against her skin, and tried to calm her frantic pulse. Outside, the wind had died, leaving a deep, unsettling silence. She dropped her head back to the pillow, forcing her trembling body to relax. But the memory of that dream-laden sound lingered, the shattering of the wall. She lay awake long into the night, unable to quiet the terror that seeped from her heart into her bones. By morning, she'd had precious little sleep, yet she stirred from her cramped cot, lit a fresh candle, and did her best to tidy her appearance. The corridor was bitterly cold, forcing her to wrap her cloak tight as she made her way to the small corner of the castle where Harmon kept his dusty library. She found him rummaging through a trunk, pulling out old maps that threatened to tear at the creases. The sight of his determined face, highlighted by the early gray light creeping in through a narrow window, gave her a modest spark of hope. He looked up, smiling wanly. "I sent for Kareth. He should arrive soon." "Memnani." She nodded, stepping over piles of books. "Any luck with the maps?" He grimaced. "All contradictory. Some show a valley in the western mountains that might lead to the rumored grove. Others reference a pass that hasn't been traversed in decades. We might have to rely on local guides, wildlings or rangers who've gone that route." The mention of wildlings conjured images of fierce clans who roamed freely, harassing the Watch whenever the opportunity arose. Not an ideal prospect, but maybe necessity would demand such an alliance, if such a word could even apply. They heard footsteps in the corridor, a measured, confident stride. Harmon quickly placed the maps face down on the table, clearing his throat. A firm knock sounded at the door. He called for the newcomer to enter. The door swung open, and Kareth stepped inside. He was taller than Mara remembered, or perhaps he simply carried himself with more presence. His short beard was peppered with gray, and he wore the black of the Night's Watch with an ease that spoke of decades in service. His eyes flicked to Mara, a faint spark of recognition crossing his features, then settled on Harmon. "Maester," he said, tone polite if guarded. Harmon limped over, leaning on his stick. "Thank you for coming, Kareth. Apologies for the ruse, but I needed to speak with you on a matter requiring discretion." Kareth's gaze narrowed slightly, scanning the clutter of books and Mara's stance by the table. He closed the door behind him, clicking the latch. "So there's no wound?" His tone was neutral, but there was a hint of annoyance at having been summoned under false pretenses. Harmon shook his head slowly. "No physical one. But we do have a dire situation, one that touches on the old gods." He waited, watching Kareth's reaction carefully. Mara did the same, noticing how the ranger's shoulders tensed, though his expression remained calm. Kareth looked from one to the other. "Go on." Harmon gave Mara a slight nod, indicating she should speak. She cleared her throat, stepping forward, heart pounding. "Kareth, I know this may sound unbelievable, but you pray to the old gods, so perhaps you'll at least hear me out." She swallowed, forcing her voice to remain steady. I've encountered the children of the forest. Not in a vision or old tale, but in flesh. They still live, hidden in the woods beyond the wall, and they mean to destroy it. A heavy quiet fell. Kareth's gaze sharpened, flicking between her eyes as if searching for any trace of madness or deceit. He said nothing at first. Seconds ticked by, each one tightening the knot in Mara's stomach. Finally, he spoke, voice low. "That is a strong claim. Why would they want to destroy the wall?" She drew a breath. "They believe it's a scar on the land. They see men as having broken an ancient pact, and they want to return things to how they were before. They've begun gathering their magic. Old magic. They're set on bringing it down. I've seen glimpses in visions. I was pulled into their circle." Her voice quavered on the last words. She saw his jaw clench, but he didn't laugh, nor did he dismiss her outright. "That was something." Harmon spoke up. "We found references in ancient texts that support this possibility, though the details are sketchy. The children are tied to weirwoods, and these texts speak of older pacts, older spells. If they succeed, the results could be catastrophic. Not just for the Watch, but for all the realms of men." "Menti Miguel." Kareth exhaled slowly, a pensive crease forming between his brows. "I've heard the stories. How they once aided men against the White Walkers. How they shaped the land at the neck. But that was long ago. Are you certain it wasn't just, I don't know, illusions in the wind? Or a dream conjured by the cold?" Mara met his gaze, her desperation plain. "I touched their hands. I felt their power. I've never known fear like that, or wonder. They're real. and I believe they're already preparing to act. We can't sit idle. Das denn. Kareth rubbed his chin, stepping closer, his boots scraping on the stone floor. If it's true, we should inform the Lord Commander at once. Harmon shook his head vigorously. He would scoff, or worse, he might see it as delusion or a sign of desertion talk. A claim like this, it risks too much, especially if we can't prove it yet. Kareth's gaze flicked to the maester's trunk, noticing the half-hidden maps. So you intend to leave, gather proof, or try to make contact? Mara nodded. Yes. There's a rumored sacred grove in the western mountains. The old texts speak of it as a place where the children once parleyed with men. We think they might converge there, or at least we might find some sign. They're truly uniting to bring down the wall? That might be the site of their ritual. Batinder. Silence dragged. She could almost hear the hammering of her own heartbeat. Finally Kareth spoke, his voice quieter than before. If they succeed, the White Walkers. Everything beyond the wall. He did not finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. The realms of men would be defenseless against horrors once kept at bay. He looked at Mara. What makes you think they'll listen to us even if we find them? She hesitated. I don't know that they will, but She fought to articulate the intangible feeling. They let me live when they could have ended me. One of them spoke in the common tongue, asked if I would help. That suggests they're not entirely shut to communication. Perhaps we can convince them that not all men wish them harm. Or maybe there is another way to heal this wound they feel. The ranger's eyes lingered on her face, gauging her conviction. At length, he nodded slowly. I've seen odd things north of the wall. Heard voices near Weirwoods, glimpsed shapes that vanished like ghosts. I'm no stranger to believing the unbelievable. He turned to Harmond. If you need my sword, you have it. But we must be cunning. If the commander finds out we're leaving without orders, it will mean trouble. Menderson Herisati. Relief and apprehension mingled in Mara's chest, making her feel lightheaded. Harmond managed a thin, grateful smile. Thank you, Kareth. Your help is invaluable. Kareth eyed the old maester's walking stick. You're not planning on coming yourself? Harmond smiled ruefully. I wish I could, but I'm afraid I'd only slow you down. My place is here, searching through records for any new insight. And if all else fails, if you don't return, I may have to try to convince the Lord Commander myself. Though I doubt he'll act without solid proof. His hand tightened on the top of the cane. We must hope you succeed before it's too late. Mara swallowed hard, realizing her journey would be undertaken with minimal support. Just Kareth. Maybe one more person if absolutely necessary. She tried to quell the tremor in her hands. When do we leave? Kareth glanced at her. We'll need supplies, warm clothing, rations, good boots, climbing gear if we're going into the mountains. And we'll need horses, though the deeper we go, the less helpful they'll be in the snowdrifts. We'll gather what we can. Perhaps we can slip out at dusk tomorrow. Na de Wasadi. Harmon set a hand on a rolled map. Take this. It's not perfect, but it's the best reference I have. There's a route along the western edges of the forest that might lead around some of the wildling strongholds. He paused, face lined with concern. Travel as rangers on patrol, keep your heads down. I'll do what I can to cover your absence. Kareth nodded. I know a stable hand who can be trusted. He'll let us take 2 mounts without drawing too much attention. He turned back to Mara. Get some rest. Get what gear you can. Tomorrow at dusk, we'll meet at the old postern gate on the west side of the castle. She dipped her head, trying to hide the nerves twisting her gut. All right. He lingered a moment longer, studying both of them with a grave expression. We might not come back. Mara's voice came out soft. I know. Then he turned and left the chamber, his footfalls echoing in the corridor. When he was gone, Harmon settled onto a chair, breathing out shakily. He's a good man, and brave. I only wish there were more like him. He offered her a small but earnest look. Be careful, Mara. The forest may hold more perils than we know. And if the children catch wind of your approach, well, let us hope that your earlier contact with them grants you a measure of safety. She nodded, stepping closer to the table where the map lay. She ran her fingers over the drawn lines. Rivers, slopes, the cryptic markings that signified weirwood groves. Each line felt like a step on a path that could lead to salvation or ruin. "I'll do my best," she promised. "For all our sakes." After spending another hour discussing details, memorizing what landmarks they could, she returned to her small room. Arms full of supplies Harmon gave her. Warmer gloves, a better cloak, extra wool socks. She laid them out on her cot. Outside, the day slipped by in a haze of routine noises. Men shouting, the ring of steel, the murmur of conversation near the stables. She forced herself to doze a little, ignoring the roil of her thoughts. She dreamt of swirling shapes in the forest, lights drifting among the trunks like living flames. The moment she tried to approach, the lights dissolved into nothing, leaving her alone in the dark. Evening descended again. She stirred, consumed a bit of bread she'd stashed, then quietly made her way back to the courtyard. A handful of ravens circled overhead, cawing in the red-tinged sky. The air had grown colder, slicing through the layers of her clothing. She made her way to the west side of the castle, avoiding direct routes. Guards were posted along the inner walls, but she slipped past with the ease of someone who knew the old corners. At last, she arrived at the postern gate. A smaller, seldom-used entry sat within a recess of the wall, hidden behind stacked crates and a dilapidated wagon. Kareth stood in the shadows, clad in heavy black furs, a sword at his hip, a bow slung across his shoulder. 2 horses stood behind him, quietly snorting in the cold. He lifted a hand in greeting. She approached, nodding. "All set." He patted the saddlebags. "As much as we can be. We should go before the next patrol circles here." He unlatched the gate carefully, peering out into the darkening evening. Beyond lay a white vista, the snow reflecting the last glimmer of the sunset in streaks of pink and gray. The wind whispered across the open ground, carrying an undercurrent of dread that only she might sense. Mara tried not to let it shake her. They slipped through, leading the horses out. Kareth closed the gate behind them, latching it gently so it would not clang. The castle faded at their backs, its walls dark silhouettes against the sky. Mara walked beside the taller ranger, the crunch of snow beneath their boots the only sound. She dared a glance behind. Castle Black stood silent, sentinel-like, under the towering presence of the wall that stretched infinitely into the gloom. She wondered if it might be the last time she ever beheld it. Kareth guided them onto a winding trail. They mounted up, riding in single file as the trail quickly vanished into deeper drifts. Mara's horse snorted, stamping its hooves at the cold. She patted its flank, murmuring reassurances as her eyes scanned the tree line looming ahead. This was the haunted forest, aptly named, she thought, given what might lurk among the trunks. They pressed on, darkness gathering around them like a living presence. The moon rose, pale and weak behind drifting clouds, granting just enough light to make out the shapes of skeletal trees. Kareth paused once to check the position of a star low on the horizon, then steered them further west. From time to time, an owl hooted or a branch crackled under the weight of ice, making Mara's heart jolt. Each time, Kareth turned sharply, bow half drawn, eyes probing the dark. They encountered no one and nothing, yet the silence felt thicker than ordinary night. At length, they found a small hollow beneath a rocky overhang where the snow was less deep. Kareth dismounted, helping Mara do the same. He tethered the horses loosely, letting them forage a bit among the sparse brush. They had to conserve the feed they carried for the harsher stretches ahead. "We'll rest here a couple hours," Kareth murmured, kneeling to clear a spot for a fire. "We need to keep our strength, but we can't risk too big a flame." He built a small fire using dry twigs from his pack and bits of kindling, coaxing the spark to life with careful breaths. Mara knelt beside him, cupping her hands around the fledgling flames to shield them from the breeze. Soon, a faint glow lit their faces, offering a little warmth. They sat side by side, letting the heat seep into their numb fingers. The horses shuffled nearby, occasionally snorting softly. Mara realized she hadn't spoken much since leaving the castle. The tension and the cold had stolen her words. She studied Kareth's profile in the dancing firelight. "Thank you," she said quietly, for trusting us enough to come." He shrugged, but his eyes were thoughtful. "I've worn the black a long time, seen enough to know the world is bigger than we can imagine. If there's even a chance the children aim to destroy the wall, we can't ignore it." He paused, stirring the little fire. "But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't afraid. The children's magic. It's not something a sword can stop." She nodded, thinking of that overwhelming sensation of power she'd felt in their presence. "I'm afraid too." She wondered if, in times past, men had sat like this around campfires, discussing their dread of ancient mysteries. Perhaps this was part of a cycle, repeating through time. She felt no comfort in that thought. They ate a simple meal of hard bread and dried meat, washing it down with water that had to be kept close to their bodies so it wouldn't freeze solid. The fire crackled softly, embers dancing. When they were done, Kareth extinguished the flames, carefully burying the embers. No point leaving a trail of smoke for wildlings or worse to follow. He unrolled a thin bedroll. "Try to sleep, but keep your blade close. We'll leave before dawn." "Nan." She did as he suggested, lying on her side, cloak wrapped tight. The ground was unforgiving, cold leaching through every layer. She listened to the night, the soft rustle of branches overhead. Eventually, exhaustion drew her into a restless slumber, haunted by flickers of green fire in her dreams, shapes half glimpsed that darted between twisting roots. She woke once with a start, heart pounding, convinced she'd heard that same melodic call from her earlier visions. But Kareth slept undisturbed beside her, and the horses remained calm. She forced herself to close her eyes again, drifting in and out of uneasy dozing until the faintest hint of gray touched the horizon. They rose stiffly, stamping life into numb feet. The small fire pit lay dark, the stones cold to the touch. Kareth saddled the horses while Mara gathered the gear. Without a word, they mounted and rode on. The forest deepened as they continued west, the terrain uneven and blanketed in snow that hid sudden dips and ridges. Once, Mara's horse stumbled in a hollow drift, nearly unseating her. Kareth helped guide the animal back to firmer ground. No conversation passed between them for hours. The day wore on, and the clouds thickened overhead, threatening heavier snowfall. By midday, the snow came in fits and starts, swirling around them and cutting their visibility. Mara's cheeks stung from the onslaught, and her eyelashes clumped together with ice. Still, they pushed forward, guided by Kareth's sense of direction and the occasional glance at the map. When the wind died momentarily, they caught a distant sound, a low rumble, like shifting ice or far-off thunder. Kareth reined in. "Hear that?" She nodded, heart quickening. "Sounds like something collapsing, but I can't be sure." A memory of her dream flashed in her mind, that monstrous crack echoing through her skull. She shivered, hoping it was simply the echo of a small avalanche in the distant mountains. They pressed on. At times, the trees gave way to more open terrain, rolling hills dotted with shrubs. The wind swept mercilessly across these stretches, forcing them to hunch over their mounts. Other times, they wound through denser stands of pines and firs, the thick boughs overhead creaking with the weight of snow. Once, they spotted prints in the fresh drifts, large, as though from a bear, though they appeared to vanish into a cluster of fallen logs. They gave the area a wide berth. Eventually, as dusk threatened, Kareth guided them to a rocky ridge overlooking a small frozen stream. The view was limited in the swirling snow, but from the ridge, he pointed west. "We follow that stream until we reach a fork," he said, squinting at the map he'd tucked under his cloak. "The pass we want should be north of it." She peered into the gray gloom. The forest looked endless. "Let's hope the fork isn't too far," she murmured, stroking her horse's neck to calm it. The animal fidgeted, perhaps sensing her nerves. They urged the horses downhill, picking their way carefully among slick stones and hidden ice. At the bottom, the stream's surface glistened with a thin layer of frozen crust. A faint trickle of water sounded beneath, indicating the ice wasn't thick enough for crossing in some places. They followed the stream's edge, hooves crunching on a mixture of snow and old ice. The sound was strangely soothing after the long silence. But Mara's mind teemed with thoughts of what lay ahead. Were the children already gathered in their secret grove, weaving spells that gnawed at the walls, ancient enchantments? She tried to sense anything through that faint link she might have gained from touching their circle. But all she felt was a persistent tingling at the back of her skull, like the memory of a half-forgotten tune. Night fell quickly under storm-laden skies. They found a small clearing to camp in again, hidden behind a rise of boulders. This time, Kareth risked lighting a tiny fire for warmth. The wind had picked up, and the temperature dropped so sharply that Mara's breath froze on her scarf within moments. They both huddled near the flames, faces drawn with fatigue. She studied the man across from her, noticing the lines in his face, the intensity in his eyes. "Kareth," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the wind. "What made you choose the watch?" He looked up, surprised by the question. For a moment, it seemed he might brush it off. But then he shrugged. "I was born in a northern village near Long Lake. My family were hunters. When I was 14, the raiders came, burned our huts, killed most. I survived by chance, ran deep into the woods. Eventually, a Night's Watch patrol found me." He exhaled, the pain of memory visible. "I had nowhere else to go, so I went to the wall. Took the black." His gaze drifted to the flickering fire. "Sometimes I think it saved me. Other times I wonder if it's just a slow death in cold and shadows." She weighed his words, sympathy stirring in her. "I'm sorry. No one should have to live through that." He glanced at her, eyebrows lifting slightly. "What about you? You said you were once at Castle Black, working in the rookery. You were raised there?" "Madam." She shook her head. "I came north with my father, who was a steward. I was barely old enough to carry a tray. We ended up staying. I learned to tend ravens because the maester needed an extra set of hands." A trace of sadness flickered in her expression. "My father died on arranging. After that, I stayed on a while longer. But eventually, I left. There was nothing for me here. Or so I thought. I wandered south, did odd jobs, never finding a place to really belong." "Naum?" He nodded, and a companionable silence settled between them. Outside the circle of firelight, the wind swept across the barren clearing, howling among the boulders. Their horses huddled together for warmth. After a time, Kareth roused himself to extinguish the flames once more, carefully dispersing the embers. They curled into their cloaks, side by side, bracing against the cold that seeped into their bones. Above, the night sky was a tangle of clouds and faint stars, offering no comfort. They pressed on by dawn, continuing along the stream until it bent southward. A second tributary branched from it, narrower and choked with ice. Kareth consulted the map. "This must be it. We follow this offshoot north into the foothills." The day's ride was grueling. The storm from the previous night had thickened the snow, and the terrain grew steeper, forcing them to pick their route carefully. Several times, they had to dismount and lead the horses on foot. The animals snorted and balked at icy ledges or pockets of loose rock hidden beneath drifts. The wind hissed through crevices, cutting at their faces. By midday, they reached a plateau ringed with pines bowed under heavy snow. From this vantage, they could see the outline of the mountains rising ahead, jagged peaks looming like dark teeth against the gray sky. Kareth pointed to a gap between two particularly tall summits. "That's likely the pass." He scanned the horizon for any sign of smoke or movement. All was silent. They trekked onward, eventually finding a narrow defile that angled upward. Here, traveling with horses was increasingly difficult. The path was often just wide enough for a single rider, with steep drops on one side. Mara's horse slipped once, dislodging a cascade of small rocks. She clutched the reins, heart lurching, but Kareth grabbed the bridle and steadied the animal before it could tumble. They pressed on, the air growing thinner and colder. At last, they crested a ridge and descended into a sheltered valley. It was late afternoon, the light softening into a muted amber. The valley floor stretched out below, a patchwork of frozen streams, snow-laden meadows, and clusters of ancient pines. In the distance, they saw the silhouette of a broad ring of trees, taller and darker than the rest, as though guarding something older than the forest itself. Kareth reined it in, lips parting in wonder. "Is that a weirwood grove?" He pointed. Even at this distance, Mara could see the pale trunks reflecting the waning light, a scattering of white shadows among the darker pines. Her pulse kicked. Could be. The shape. It feels right. She recalled the grove where she'd encountered the children before. The hush in the air, the sense that the forest itself was aware. She felt something akin to a tug in her chest, as if an invisible thread pulled her forward. "We should approach carefully." Kareth nodded. "We'll find a place to hide the horses. If the children are there, best not announce our presence with hooves clopping over ice." He guided them to a stand of fir trees near the ridgeline. They dismounted, secured the horses, and removed what gear they couldn't afford to lose. Kareth took his bow, a quiver of arrows, and his sword. Mara slung a small pack over her shoulder, her short sword at her side. Fear hummed in her veins, tempered by a strange, inevitable pull. They made their way down into the valley on foot. Each step crunched softly in the snow. The silence pressed upon them as though the world was holding its breath. Occasionally, a bird fluttered in the branches overhead, sending little flurries of snow drifting down, but no other sound disturbed the hush. The weirwood grove loomed closer with each cautious step. Pale trunks like silent sentinels ringed around a central space. As they neared, Mara's heart pounded so loudly she feared Kareth could hear it. When they reached the edge of the grove, she gasped softly. The weirwood stood tall, their bark ghostly white against the encroaching dusk, branches twisted in shapes reminiscent of outstretched arms. Some bore carved faces, their red sap tears long since frozen into ruby droplets. A presence pulsed here, tangible as an electric charge in the cold air. It was the same sensation she'd felt in the clearing with the children, though stronger, more ancient. She saw Kareth's eyes widen. Slowly they moved between the trunks, stepping onto a bed of old needles and drifted snow. The stillness was profound, as though no wind dared stir the branches. Mara found herself glancing around, half expecting to see luminous eyes peering from behind a trunk. She recalled the chant, the circle of slender figures. Her breath quickened. She whispered under her breath, "Is anyone here?" The words sounded small, lost among the silent giants. Kareth nudged her arm, nodding toward the center of the grove. A single weirwood stood there, larger than the others. Its trunk split in a deep cleft that resembled a mouth. The face carved into it was worn but still visible, a stern visage with hollow eyes. Snow covered the ground in mounds around the roots. No footprints disturbed it, no sign of movement. Mara felt drawn to that central tree, the primal heart of the grove. She stepped forward, leaving Kareth behind for a moment. Her pulse raced, fear and a strange reverence intermingling. She placed a trembling hand on the bark. Instantly, a faint warmth radiated beneath her palm, as if the tree's essence recognized her. She shut her eyes, recalling the swirl of visions from before. A low hum vibrated in her mind, akin to the distant rumble of a drum. She waited, breath shallow, hoping to feel the children's presence again. She whispered, "I'm here. I came to speak, to understand." No answer came, only the hush of the grove. Seconds passed, and she opened her eyes, meeting only the tree's carved visage. Disappointment and relief warred within her. Kareth stepped up beside her, voice hushed. "No sign of them. Are you sure this is the place?" She shook her head, confusion gnawing at her. I'm not certain." She felt foolish, standing there, calling out to ancient beings who did not appear. Yet the hum in her mind persisted, growing more defined, a subtle vibration that made her fingertips tingle against the bark. She focused on it, as though listening to a distant heartbeat. A flicker of movement caught the corner of her vision, making her spin around, hand on the hilt of her sword. Nothing. Only the shadows among the trees. She exhaled shakily. "They're here," she murmured. "Or they were. I can feel it." Kareth scanned the perimeter, arrow nocked in his bow. Then where? He fell silent. From somewhere deeper in the grove came a faint rustle, like leaves shifting when there was no wind. Mara's heart leapt into her throat. She and Kareth stood back to back, scanning the gloom. Another rustle, closer. She thought she glimpsed a pair of glowing eyes reflecting the pale light. In a half-ring around them, shapes began to emerge from behind the broad trunks, small forms blending with the bark and snow. Mara's breath stopped. They were here, the children of the forest. More of them than she'd seen before. A dozen, maybe more. Their slight bodies were draped in living bark and fibers that blended seamlessly with the surroundings. Their hair, tangled with moss and twigs, framed faces that were ageless and alien. The nearest one stepped forward silently, tilting its head to regard Mara. Its eyes glimmered a deep green, wise and watchful. Kareth tensed, bow half drawn, but Mara reached out, putting a trembling hand on his arm. "Don't," she whispered. "They could kill us both in an instant if they wanted." He lowered the bow slowly, though his entire body remained taut. The child before them raised a slender hand, palm outward, in a halting gesture. Mara recognized the posture. It was not an attack, but neither was it a greeting of warmth. It was caution. She met the being's gaze, trying to calm her hammering pulse. "We came to speak," she said in a low, clear voice. "We know what you plan to do to the wall, and we want to find another way." Her words drifted into the hush. The children exchanged glances, their expressions inscrutable. One of them stepped closer, a figure slightly taller than the rest, though still not much bigger than a human child. Its hair was streaked with pale strands as if frosted. It studied Mara intensely, eyes like polished stones. Then it spoke, each syllable soft yet resonant, the common tongue shaped strangely by its mouth. "You came, though you know our purpose. You came." Mara's throat went dry. She forced herself to stand steady. "Yes. We can't let the wall be destroyed. Too many lives depend on it. Is there no other path?" The being's eyes flickered. Others in the circle shifted, an undercurrent of motion crossing the group. A second voice emerged from another child, higher pitched, as delicate as a breeze through leaves. "You trespass in the old place. The pact was broken. The wound remains. Blood calls for blood." Mara felt her stomach twist. She recalled the swirl of runic shapes, the memory of their chanting. "I've seen your vision," she said softly. "I've felt the land's pain. But if you do this, the White Walkers will pour south. Men will perish in untold numbers. You will be unleashing a new darkness." A hush fell, and the tall child gazed at her with an expression that might have held sorrow. Its words came slow, deliberate, as though each took great effort. "Darkness is already here. Men spread it, men feed it. The wall keeps out one darkness, but nurtures another. This is the price. The land must be made whole, or all shall die." Mara's eyes burned with sudden tears. Kareth stood rigid at her side. She could sense his confusion and fear, but also a tremor of awe. She pressed forward. "Please, give us a chance to help heal the land without tearing down the wall. The old alliances, there must be a way to forge them again." A flicker of movement drew her attention. From the gloom, another child stepped forward, slender hands clasped around an object that glimmered faintly in the twilight. A crystalline shard, smooth and translucent. The child held it aloft, and Mara's breath caught as she sensed power radiating from it, a cold, sharp energy akin to ice, yet alive. The tall child's voice came, quiet and solemn. "Prove your words. Prove men's hearts have changed, else we break the ice that men cling to." Mara swallowed hard. "How?" The child placed the shard gently on the snow at Mara's feet. "Take the shard. Carry it to the seat of men's power. Show them the truth, that the land bleeds. If they come to heal, not harm, we wait. If not, we free the land." "Aeon." Kareth cast a troubled look at Mara. "Seat of men's power? Do they mean the south? Which seat?" His voice faltered, but the child seemed to comprehend. "Swords and crowns of men. Once did they pledge. Now they must pledge anew. If no pledge is given, we act." Mara felt the impossibility of it. Rally the southern kings or lords to a new pact with the children of the forest, a treaty to protect the land, to preserve the old magic. She could barely imagine the scorn or fear with which they'd be met. But in the face of those luminous eyes, she found no argument. She bent down carefully, hands shaking, and picked up the shard. It was surprisingly light, but the chill made her fingers numb instantly. She looked up at the circle of solemn faces. "I understand," she managed, though she hardly did. The tall child bent its head. "Go. Time runs short." The entire circle began to fade backward, as if melting into the trunks and undergrowth. Mara's breath came in gasps, her mind racing. She wanted to shout more questions. "How long do we have? How can we reach you again?" But she sensed no further answers would be given. Kareth watched the shapes withdraw, his bow slack in his hands. Within moments, the grove was empty, except for the faint rustle of branches overhead. Mara looked at him, then at the shard in her hands. A swirl of panic, hope, and dread collided in her chest. "They've given us a chance. But how in the seven hells are we to convince men of this threat, let alone gain their vow?" Her voice shook. Kareth rubbed a hand over his mouth, his breath a cloud in the cold air. "The Lord Commander will never believe it. Most lords in the south won't either. The realm is fractured. Who holds power that the children would recognize?" She turned the shard, watching moonlight refract inside it in swirling lines. The cold bit into her fingers, but she couldn't bring herself to put it away. "We may have to try. There's no alternative if we want to prevent the wall from being shattered." She met his gaze. "We go south. We find whichever lord or king still listens. We make them understand." "Neshi." He nodded slowly, though his eyes were filled with as much doubt as her own. She stood, setting the shard gently in a pouch at her belt. The cold radiated through the leather, chilling her side. "Come on," she said quietly. "We should get back to the horses before the weather turns again." As they left the grove, she cast one last look at the ancient weirwood. Its face seemed to watch them go. Pale bark, streaked with the red of dried sap tears. A silent witness to a conversation that could decide the fate of all. She felt a wave of sorrow, a sense that the path ahead would test them beyond what they knew. But for now, they had a mission. However desperate or mad it seemed, it was their only hope. To speak for the old pact, to prevent the downfall of the wall and the realm that stood behind it. They reached their horses and mounted once more, the soft hush of falling snow enveloping them. As they ascended the ridge, the grove receded behind them, swallowed by the twilight. Neither spoke for a time, each lost in the enormity of what had transpired. Mara clutched the reins with one hand, her other hand pressed to the pouch where the shard lay. Her mind spun with questions. She wondered if this token would truly sway the hearts of men, or if they would dismiss it as a mere curiosity. She wondered if the children could be placated or if their resolve was already set. Above all, she wondered if the realm had enough unity left to forge a new pact in time. Kareth finally broke the silence. "We can't go back to Castle Black. Not yet. They'd never let us leave a second time. We have to head south, maybe to Winterfell, or beyond." "Down?" She nodded, an ache forming in her chest, at the thought of how far they had to ride. How many obstacles lay between them and any possible success. Winterfell's as good a start as any. The Starks have always kept the old gods. If any house might listen first, it's them. He spurred his horse forward. The wind caught at their cloaks as they began the long journey down the mountain pass, away from the silent valley. Snow drifted in gentle swirls, dusting their hair and eyelashes. The moon hung overhead, a pale lantern in the vast darkness. Mara let her gaze linger on it, feeling a pang of longing for the safety of a warm hearth. The simplicity of days gone by. But she pushed the thought away. Whatever comfort she had known was dwarfed by the task set before her. As they rode, the sound of the horses' hooves crunched in the snow, and the wind whispered through the pines. The night enveloped them, endless and cold. She clutched the shard at her side, feeling its biting chill, wondering if it would remain a symbol of hope, or become a testament to men's failure. Ahead lay a world unprepared for the truths she carried, a realm weighed down by its own politics and feuds. Yet, if no one believed, If no one pledged, the wall would fall, and the ensuing chaos would dwarf any war the kingdoms had ever known. She guided her horse beside Kareth's, the two silhouettes blending into the moonlit snowscape, forging a path southward. A spark of determination flared in her chest, fueled by necessity if not by confidence. The children had opened a door for them, and they had no choice but to walk through it. Step by step, mile by mile, with the frozen winds at their backs and the shard of ancient power chilling her side, they began the perilous ride that might save the wall, or witness its end. Kya Kay. Night pressed in around them as they descended the slopes of that hidden valley, the great weirwood grove fading behind a curtain of pine trees and drifting snow. They rode in silence, each lost to private thoughts that spiraled with worry and wavering hope. The shard at Mara's belt pulsed with cold, and sometimes she felt it throb like a second heartbeat against her hip. She tried not to dwell on it too intently, afraid that it might somehow carry her thoughts back to the children, or that it might magnify her doubts until they overwhelmed her. The wind blew steadily, a constant companion they had grown to expect. It sifted thin veils of snow across their path, obscuring hazards in the darkness. Mara's horse snorted, and she leaned low in the saddle, patting its neck. The moon's pale light guided them along a narrow ridge that overlooked a stony gorge. They navigated slowly, avoiding the precarious drop on their left. Each hooffall on the rocky ground sent echoes bouncing across the ravine. Kareth led the way. He occasionally paused to scan the dark horizon, sometimes lifting a hand as if to hush all the world, then continued when his sharp ears detected nothing amiss. The tension radiating from him was unmistakable. His shoulders were rigid, and his face, half hidden by a fur-lined hood, was set in a vigilant frown. Mara could almost feel the caution in his every movement. He had glimpsed the children up close, heard their voices, and he had listened to them declare that the land must be made whole, even if it meant upending the realm's very defense. Now, each step south felt like treading a thin line between salvation and doom. They made slow but steady progress until the snow started coming down harder. Flakes fell in thick clumps, coating their cloaks, turning their hoods into heavy, sodden burdens. The horses began to slip more often. Kareth kept his bow unstrung for fear that moisture would ruin the sinew. Mara found her hands trembling from the cold whenever she tried to grip the reins tighter. Their fingers were half numb, and the stinging wind burned their faces. Finally, they spotted a low outcrop beneath which a few scraggly trees huddled, half buried in drifts. Kareth signaled with an upraised hand. "We'll rest there," he said, raising his voice to be heard over the wind's mournful howl. Mara nodded, too cold to speak. She squinted against the swirling snow, guiding her mount closer. They dismounted with stiff limbs. The horses stood with heads bowed, flanks quivering. Mara felt a surge of pity for the poor beasts and fumbled in a saddlebag for a bit of grain. The wind threatened to yank her hood off, so she held it in place with one hand while offering feed with the other. The horse nibbled, breath steaming. Beside her, Kareth loosened the girths, allowing the animals some reprieve, and rubbed them down with a rough cloth to ease the caked snow and ice from their coats. Mara crouched under the overhang, stamping her feet to coax feeling back into her toes. The small recess in the rock offered partial relief from the wind, though flurries still swirled inside. Her own cloak, stiff with frost at the edges, dripped slowly from the hem. She glanced at the dark sky. Clouds smothered the moon now, leaving them with only faint luminescence reflecting from the snow. Kareth gathered a handful of dry branches and coaxed a meager fire to life. The moment the flames caught, Mara sank onto her knees beside it, warming her palms, trying not to wince at the painful tingling as circulation returned. The tiny fire hissed in the gusts, and she held her breath, waiting to see if it would endure. Gradually the flicker steadied, offering precious warmth to their half-frozen bodies. Neither spoke for a while. The wind whistled above their rocky haven, moaning like a lost spirit drifting across the northern wilds. At last, Kareth broke the silence. "We'll push as far south as we can each day," he said, his voice subdued. "We'll seek a main road before near the wall. We can't risk returning to Castle Black. If we arrive at the gates, they'll detain us. Questions, suspicion, maybe even arrest. We need to slip around it. Nememstai. Nin Gur. Mara nodded, eyes fixed on the meager flames. There's a spot east of the Shadow Tower where smugglers sometimes cross, she said softly, trying to recall old rumors gleaned from Ranger's fireside chatter. A hidden path through the foothills. It bypasses the main castle outposts. If we find it, we can get south without being seen. Kareth nodded thoughtfully, his gaze flickering to her. You're certain? She shook her head, offering a wan smile. I'm not certain of anything, but I heard talk. Some called it the Ghost Step. Supposedly, if you're brave enough to risk a narrow ledge and a few old rope bridges, you can slip around the western side of the mountains without passing near the Watch's patrols. Damen, he grunted. A dangerous route, but maybe less dangerous than trying to talk our way through a garrison that sees us as deserters. He rubbed his gloved palms together, then dug into a saddlebag. He pulled out a water skin, took a swig, and passed it to her. She sipped, the water bitterly cold against her tongue. We'll aim for that path, he said. But the snow may slow us down. If we don't find it, we'll need a plan B. Nice more. She handed back the water skin, eyeing the swirling darkness beyond the flickering firelight. It's like the forest itself wants to hold us here. His expression tightened. Yes, I feel it too. He paused, fiddling with a stray twig before tossing it into the flames. That shard, he said, his voice quieter. Do you feel anything from it now? Mara shifted her weight, pressing a hand to the pouch at her belt. She had tried to ignore the object's presence, but she couldn't fully escape its ominous chill. It's like an ache that never fades, she admitted. I sense a distant humming in my mind sometimes, especially when I'm scared or uncertain. I don't know if it's the shard itself or just my imagination. Kareth frowned, staring at the weak fire. Let's hope it's not connected to them in a way that betrays our position. We have no clue how their magic works. A tremor ran through her. The children had not said they would track her, but they hadn't said they wouldn't. Perhaps they had no need to track her so long as she carried that piece of their power. She let her gaze wander to the darkness, half expecting to see those glowing eyes. They gave it to us willingly, she murmured. They must know we have to travel south. He raked fingers through his dark, half-frozen hair, exhaling a plume of white breath. We'll have to trust that they won't strike us down now. They want men to pledge anew. They need us to deliver their warning. She drew the cloak tighter, recalling that one of the children had indeed said, "If no pledge is given, we act." The ultimatum hung in her mind. Perhaps they wouldn't interfere until they learned whether men would heed this call. She took a final look at the small fire. Let's douse this, she said, before it draws attention. The flames are bright against the dark. Anyone passing might see. He dipped his head in agreement, then carefully scattered snow over the embers. A thin wisp of steam curled upwards. The darkness rushed in, making the starlight overhead seem faint and far away. They settled against the rock, curling into their cloaks for warmth. The wind roared not far above them, but the little overhang took the worst of it. Their horses stood in a meager huddle, sides pressed together. Mara watched them for a time, lulled by the quiet shifting of hooves. At last, weariness overcame her. She folded her arms over her chest, laid her head against the rock, and let her eyes drift shut. Darkness enveloped her thoughts, but in her dreams, the images returned. Visions of the wall, fracturing, colossal shards of ice crashing like thunder, echoing across a land smothered in snow. She glimpsed shapes in the swirling cold, figures of men in black cloaks, running in terror from the unstoppable ruin. Yet she also saw others, monstrous silhouettes with eyes shining blue, stepping through the breach. She woke with a gasp, heart racing, a sheen of sweat chilling her neck. Her abrupt movement made Kareth stir. He looked at her, concern etched in the faint starlight. She only shook her head, pressing trembling fingers to her temples. "Bad dream," she whispered. He nodded and settled back, though she sensed he stayed awake, watching her with guarded empathy. Eventually, she slipped into a lighter, dreamless sleep. only to wake again at dawn when thin light began to silver the horizon. The wind had calmed. Beneath the gray sky, the world lay hushed and desolate. Their breath showed in clouds as they packed up, checked the horses, and set off once more. The next few days blended into a stark odyssey of snow-laden trails and frigid nights. They steered a wide course through narrow passes and thick stands of evergreens, always angling south and west. They saw little wildlife, only the occasional scrawny hare darting across the drifts. Once they glimpsed a wolf pack prowling a distant ridge, dark silhouettes against the pale snow. But the wolves paid them no mind. At times, the sun broke through, revealing glacial vistas of breathtaking beauty. Icicles clung to branches, glittering in the light, and the pristine snowfields stretched endlessly under a bright sky. During those fleeting moments, Mara felt an odd peace, as though the land itself was trying to show its softer face. But inevitably, clouds returned, and with them came the biting wind and the sense of isolation. Each night, they found some hollow or sheltered thicket to make camp, never daring more than a small, brief fire. They spoke little beyond what was necessary to plan the next day's route. As they pressed deeper into the foothills, the terrain grew treacherous. Rocks jutted from under shallow snow, and hidden ice threatened to unseat their horses at any misstep. They kept to game trails wherever possible, but it wasn't always an option. Mara's muscles ached from hours of tense riding. Kareth's face took on a drawn, gaunt look. Still, their resolve propelled them forward. On the 5th day, after leaving the grove, a storm rose, fierce and sudden. By midday, they found themselves battling winds that whipped the snow into blinding sheets. Visibility dropped to a few dozen yards. Kareth shouted something Mara could barely hear over the gale, pointing toward a cluster of boulders. She nodded, urging her horse to follow. Beneath the partial cover of those stones they crouched, cloaks flapping wildly. "We can't ride in this," Kareth yelled above the roar of the wind. "We'll break a leg or worse." Mara could only nod. The storm hammered down with relentless fury, stinging her cheeks and making her eyes water. She scrambled to tether her horse more securely. All the while the wind tugged at her, threatening to topple her into a drift. Kareth did the same with his mount. Snow pelted them from every direction, swirling in chaotic eddies around the rocks. Finally, they huddled side by side, bracing themselves in the narrow space between two stones that provided scant shelter. She lost track of how long they stayed there, pressed against the cold stone. It felt like hours, time swallowing them as the storm howled. They tried to keep the horses calm, stroking muzzles whenever the animals grew restless. But there was no chance of building a fire or eating properly in that chaos. Wind-blown ice cut their skin, and the temperature plummeted. More than once, Mara thought of the shard, wondering if it was somehow fueling the storm, or if the children were testing their resolve. Perhaps that was foolish. Winter storms were not uncommon here, but she couldn't shake a sense of being tested, as though unseen eyes watched from behind the swirling snow. Eventually, the storm abated into a subdued snowfall. The wind slackened. Night was already falling, an inky sky overhead, and they had barely moved from that spot all day. Exhausted, half-frozen and hungry, they clumsily cleared a small depression and managed to light a fire at last. The flames seemed to glow with extra brilliance in the oppressive darkness. They warmed their hands, though they could feel the raw sting of windburn on their faces. Kareth rummaged in a pack for rations. "We've used more food than I hoped," he said grimly, passing Mara a portion of dried meat and a chunk of hard bread. "We need to make better speed or we'll run low. Even the horses are going hungry." She chewed mechanically, forcing the leathery meat down. Her mind churned with worry. If we can reach the ghost steps soon, we might avoid more storms. The pass is said to run in a bit of a sheltered trough. She swallowed, wincing at how her throat felt raw. "But I had no idea if it's a day away or 3. He frowned into the fire. "We'll keep going at first light." A small silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of flames. Then he glanced at her, his voice softening. "How do you feel?" "The shard," and everything else. Done. Go away. She exhaled, letting her gaze drift to the swirling flakes beyond their circle of light. I feel burdened. It's as though the weight of the realm's future is too large to carry, and I'm terrified we'll fail. Every time I think of that grove in the children's eyes, She hesitated, searching for the words. I sense how ancient and unyielding they are. It's like they've already decided this must happen, but they're giving us a formality, a last chance that might not matter. He listened quietly, stirring the fire with a stick. When we reach Winterfell, if we do, what then? Will the Starks believe us? She let the question linger in the cold air. The best she could offer was a half-hearted shrug. I hope so. There's an old Godswood at Winterfell. Maybe they'll sense something in the presence of the Weirwood there. Maybe that will lend credence. Or maybe they'll see the shard and realize it's no ordinary ice. Kareth grimaced. We can only try. Beyond that, if they won't help us, the South is a maze of lords and kings, each holding tight to their crowns. It may take months, years even, to gain enough trust for a pact. The children might not wait that long. A wave of defeat battered her. She lowered her head, staring at the small flame. Then we move as fast as we can. She pulled her cloak tighter. Let's rest. We'll need every scrap of energy tomorrow. They let the fire burn a while longer, seeking its warmth before they dared extinguish it. Then they lay down, backs against the rock, using saddlebags for pillows. The wind hissed, though no longer gale force. Snow dusted their cloaks. Mara's teeth chattered at first, but she slowly fell into an exhausted sleep, mind floating through uneasy dreams in which the shards of a broken wall glimmered in the starlight like jagged teeth. She woke to Kareth shaking her shoulder gently, daylight a faint shimmer behind the falling snow. He offered a swift explanation. Storms lessened, but more could come. Best we move. They broke a hurried fast with cold bread, shared water with the horses, then mounted up. Their mounts stepped warily over the thick drifts, ears twitching at every gust. Hours passed in a slow trudge across the white wilderness. Mara watched the sky, saw clouds roll in and out, offering only fleeting glimpses of the sun. Now and then, they spotted an outcrop or a distant peak they could orient by. Kareth took frequent halts to consult the battered map Harmon had given him, although the lines on the parchment were vague, and the landmarks were half buried by winter. Still, they pressed forward with grim persistence. By midday, Mara's spirits lifted momentarily when they crested a small rise and saw, in the distance, a deep cleft running between two looming rock walls. Perhaps a canyon or pass. It angled vaguely southward, flanked by steep ridges. Kareth pointed. That might be the route you mentioned, the Ghost Step. The challenge was clear even from afar. The walls looked narrow, and the path inside was likely choked by ice. Yet the idea of a passage that led around the main stronghold spurred them onward. They reached its entrance an hour or so later, picking their way through rubble where fallen boulders had tumbled from the cliffs above. Snow swirled inside the high walls, forming drifts pressed tight against the canyon sides. A hush lay over it, as though the wind had trouble reaching so deep. They reined in, scanning the gloom that stretched before them. Kareth swung down from his saddle, took a few steps to peer inside. I see footprints, he murmured, crouching in the snow. Mara joined him, her heart quickening. Indeed, faint impressions marked the surface, likely made when the snow was softer. 2 sets, maybe 3, and not very old. Some lines in the drift suggested a sled or a makeshift travois had been dragged along. The notion that others might be traveling this hidden route set her on edge. Wildlings? Smugglers? She and Kareth exchanged a tense look. He rose, eyes scanning the canyon walls. We must be cautious. If it's smugglers, they might not welcome us. If it's wildlings... He grimaced, unsaid possibilities hanging in the air. Mara nodded, hand drifting toward the hilt of her short sword. The shard's chill seemed to intensify at the threat of conflict. She couldn't tell if it was her own reaction or the artifact's subtle power. We can't turn back, she whispered. We have to risk it. He agreed. They mounted once more, proceeding into the canyon at a slow walk. The walls were high, streaked with ice where snowmelt had frozen mid-drip. Icicles hung like crystalline spears, some longer than a man. Kareth kept his bow close at hand, arrow nocked but not fully drawn. The horses' hooves crunched on hidden gravel under shallow snow. Now and then, small rocks clattered from above, making them both jerk their heads upward, scanning the cliffs for any sign of watchers. The footprints continued deeper into the pass, twisting around large boulders that had fallen from the canyon sides. In some places, the footprints vanished where snow had blown over them, then reappeared beyond a wind-sheltered bend. They followed this trail for most of the afternoon, winding deeper. The path narrowed, forcing them at times to ride single file with the canyon walls, mere feet from their horses' flanks. At one point, Mara caught a whiff of smoke. She froze, raising a hand to alert Kareth. He nodded, dismounted, and quietly approached the next bend on foot, leading his horse. Mara trailed behind, heart pounding, senses on edge. The smoke smelled faintly of pine wood, a sure sign of a campfire. They inched forward. Around the bend, the canyon opened into a small clearing, partially sheltered by a rock shelf overhead. A campfire burned in a ring of stones. Two figures crouched near it, their backs turned. A third lay wrapped in furs, possibly asleep. They looked ragged, dressed in mismatched furs and leathers, their weapons, a pair of axes and a short spear, stacked against the rock. Several bundles lay near the fire, along with what looked like a crude sled. Wildlings perhaps, or smugglers. Mara couldn't tell at a glance, but from their attire and their posture, they were clearly not men of the watch. Kareth held up a hand, signaling Mara to stay put. He took another silent step to get a better view. But the horses, jittery in the confined space, shifted and snorted. One of the strangers jerked upright, turning with wide eyes, hand flying to a knife at his belt. The second spun as well, letting out a startled curse. A heartbeat later, the third sat up abruptly from the furs. Tension crackled in the air. Kareth lifted an open palm in a placating gesture, his other hand still holding his horse's reins. "We mean no harm," he called, voice steady but firm. The first of the strangers was a lean, wiry man with tangled black hair. His eyes flicked to Kareth's black clothing, narrowing in suspicion. "Night's Watch," he spat. "Thought we'd come far enough to avoid your lot." Mara's stomach twisted. If they believed them to be rangers intent on capturing or killing them, things could turn violent quickly. She edged forward, deciding to speak. "We're not here on watch business," she said, her breath pluming. "We're just traveling. We won't trouble you if you won't trouble us." The wiry man shot a glance at his companions, who were scrambling to their feet, weapons half drawn. One was a woman wearing a hood lined with fox fur, her face set in a snarl. The other was younger, with a gaunt, haunted look. Their expressions spoke of desperation, maybe fear. But they didn't rush forward. The wiry man took a step closer, brandishing a knife. "You've got black cloaks. You're either deserters or liars." Kareth kept his bow lowered, but Mara sensed how close he was to raising it. She forced a calm into her voice she did not feel. "We're passing through, that's all. The storm forced us this way. We won't interfere with your business." The wildling woman glared, shifting her stance. "This is no place for crows," she said in a guttural accent, referencing the slur for Night's Watch men. "What do you really want?" Mara realized that the simplest truth might serve them best. "We need to get south, quickly and quietly," she said. "That's all. We're no threat to you, truly." The wiry man barked a laugh, though it lacked humor. He looked them over, two tired riders, half frozen. The arrogance of the watch was nowhere in their posture. "If you were bigger in number, we'd fight," he muttered, his gaze flicking to Kareth's well-worn sword at his hip. After a pause, he lowered his knife a fraction. "We can't feed you, but I don't see reason to kill you." He spat to the side, then jerked his head at the narrow path behind them. "You want to move on, go ahead. But we got no love for your kind." Mara exhaled, shoulders loosening a little. "We understand," she said, relief mixing with caution. She glanced at Kareth, who offered a small nod. They started to edge their horses around the makeshift camp. The woman stayed near the fire, glaring, while the younger man hovered, hand near his spear. Only the wiry man stepped fully into their path, demanding more details with a sharp glare. "How far are you going?" Mara glanced around, choosing her words carefully. "We need to cross into the north, avoid the main castles. We heard this pass would take us around the Watchd's outposts." He snorted. "It will, if you get past the ravine." He pointed deeper into the canyon. "Bridges are rotted. You try crossing with horses, you risk your necks." Kareth exchanged a look with Mara. They couldn't afford to leave the horses behind. They'd never make the miles in time. "We'll manage," Kareth said. "We have no choice." The wildling shrugged. "Suit yourselves. If you fall, at least no one will find your bones." Then he stepped aside, waving them through with a mocking flourish of his knife. Mara tried for a tight smile of thanks. She and Kareth guided their horses past the strangers. The camp's fire crackled in the hush, and she caught a glimpse of meager supplies. A pang of empathy tugged at her. These three looked exhausted. Half-starved, possibly exiled from wherever they once called home. But there was nothing she could do. They had their own mission, and any show of pity might be misunderstood. A few steps beyond, the younger man snapped a bitter remark about crows running from their vows, but none of them made a move to attack. Soon the camp was behind and the canyon curved away, its rock walls overshadowing them again. Mara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Kareth rode beside her, bow still in hand, scanning the path behind. "They won't come after us," he said quietly. "Too few in number, and we've nothing worth stealing." She nodded, though her pulse still fluttered with nerves. "He said something about rotted bridges across a ravine. We'll have to be careful." "Non." They continued deeper, the footprints turning to a churned path where the wildlings must have dragged their sled. Then at some point, the path forked. One branch climbed a steep slope, the other vanished between sheer walls. They paused, uncertain. Kareth studied the ground for clues. One set of footprints continued upward, while the others seemed to go straight ahead. He tested the slope with one foot. Found it slick with ice and unstable gravel. "That way looks impossible with horses," he muttered. "Unless we want to drag them behind us on a rope." Mara peered down the narrower pass. "We might as well try this route. It's probably the main way." She recalled the wiry man mentioning a ravine. That likely meant the route ahead had a crossing, some precarious walkway or rope bridge. Her stomach twisted at the thought of crossing a gorge on a rotted span of wood. Still, they had no better option, so they pressed on, the canyon walls looming so high that the sky was reduced to a narrow band of gray overhead. The horse's breath puffed white in the cold air. After another half hour of walking, they heard a distant roar of water, though muffled by ice. The pass widened abruptly, opening onto the edge of a deep chasm. At its bottom, far below, a partially frozen river churned, its dark waters crashing against jagged rocks. Mara caught her breath at the dizzying sight. The noise filled the air with a low thunder. She looked to the left and right. The canyon continued across the gap, but a sheer drop of 100 feet or more yawned between them and the far side. Spanning it was a rickety rope bridge, swaying in the wind. Wooden planks, half frosted with ice, sagged between rough-hewn ropes that were anchored to stakes hammered into the stone. A second, smaller bridge hung to one side, broken in the middle, its boards dangling uselessly. Kareth walked his horse to the cliff edge, eyes narrow. "It doesn't look promising," he said, voice taut. "Those ropes could snap under the weight of a horse, and the boards might not hold." Mara's heart pounded. She recalled the wildling's sneering mention of rotted bridges. How men could lose their bones here. What if we cross on foot first? Lead the horses behind us? It might distribute the weight slightly better. He considered, scanning the anchor points. "We can try. If it fails..." He didn't finish the sentence. The roar of water below seemed to underscore the risk. She swung down from her saddle, legs trembling as she approached the bridge. The wind whipped her cloak. For a moment, she simply stared at the swaying planks, each dusted with snow, some partially splintered. Ropes creaked as the gusts tugged them. Taking a breath, she gripped the handline with one gloved hand, testing it. It felt stiff and frayed under her palm, but it held. She glanced over her shoulder at Kareth. He nodded, tension etched in his jaw. "I'll hold your horse. You go first. If it seems stable, we'll try to bring them across." She forced a shaky smile of agreement, then placed a foot on the first plank. It dipped alarmingly. The swirl of air rushing through the gorge made the bridge sway from side to side. She sucked in a breath, heart hammering. Carefully, she shifted her weight onto the second plank. Each step was agonizingly slow. The ropes groaned. The water roared far below. After a dozen steps, she paused, trembling, and looked back. Kareth waited with both horses, watching her intently. She raised a hand to signal that she was still all right. The middle of the bridge seemed the most unstable. The boards were spaced farther apart here, and her boot slipped on a patch of ice. She caught herself on the ropes, panic stabbing her chest. She exhaled a shaking breath, forced her foot to grip the next plank. Slowly she continued. By the time she reached the far side, her legs felt like water. She stumbled onto solid ground, chest heaving. Kareth exhaled in relief, though his expression remained guarded. "Seems like it'll hold a person," he called over. "But a horse is heavier, plus the supplies." She wiped sweat from her brow despite the cold. "We have to try." He stroked the nearest horse's muzzle, speaking softly to calm it. Then, gripping its reins, he led it to the bridge. The animal balked, ears flattened, hooves scraping the ground. Kareth clicked his tongue gently, tugging the reins. The horse snorted in protest, eyes rolling. Mara braced herself on the far side, gripping the rope anchors, calling softly in what she hoped was a reassuring tone. At last, the horse stepped onto the bridge, sending it into a new sway that made Mara's stomach lurch. Kareth moved with slow, steady care, one step at a time, coaxing the frightened beast forward. Each board flexed under the animal's weight, and the ropes groaned, but they held. Mara watched Kareth's face grow taut with concentration. Gusts swept through the gorge, rattling the boards. Halfway across, the horse tried to balk again, nearly tangling its hooves in the spaces between planks. Kareth had to pause, soothing it, letting the bridge sway until it stilled. Mara felt sure the ropes would snap at any moment. Finally, they made it across, the horse leaping the last step onto stable ground, ears pinned back. Mara and Kareth quickly moved it away from the edge. She pressed a trembling hand against the animal's shoulder, murmuring gratitude. Kareth's face was drawn, breath puffing in ragged bursts. For a moment, they both simply stood there, hearts racing, letting the wave of relief wash over them. One horse remained. Mara volunteered to fetch it. Her legs still shook from the crossing, but she nodded at Kareth. "I'll go. We should do it before I lose my nerve." "Nah." He didn't argue, though concern glimmered in his eyes. She mustered resolve, stepping back onto the bridge. It swayed with renewed vigor. She kept her gaze forward, ignoring the rush of the river below, ignoring the trembling in her limbs. The crossing seemed to take forever, but at last, she reached the side they'd started from. She took a moment to steady herself, patting the second horse's neck. "All right," she whispered to the creature. "Let's get this over with." Leading it onto the bridge was no easier the second time. The horse resisted, snorting in alarm. She muttered soft words, bracing with one hand on the side rope. Board by board, they inched forward. Midway across, the wind gusted, and the horse reared slightly, hooves thudding against the boards. The entire bridge jerked, ropes squeaking in protest. Mara cried out, clinging to the rope with a desperate grip. The horse nearly lost its footing. For an instant, she pictured them both plunging into the gorge, the icy waters swallowing them. But as the wind subsided, she managed to tug the reins, coaxing the animal down. The boards held. Her heart hammered. She forced her feet to keep moving, one plank at a time, until finally they reached the far side. She collapsed against Kareth, letting him grab the horse's reins while she shook with relief. He helped her away from the edge, heart pounding as hard as hers. They looked at the old bridge, swaying under the onslaught of the wind, a testament to how close they'd come to disaster. They took a few minutes to recover, breathing heavily, letting the horses calm. The success felt like a small miracle. The rest of the path wound deeper into the canyon, but at least the worst crossing seemed behind them. Gaining their composure, they mounted up again, guiding the skittish animals onward. Ahead, the canyon gradually widened, and the walls lowered, until they rose out of the pass onto rolling hills blanketed in snow. Sunlight broke through a gap in the clouds, painting the slopes in soft gold. Mara and Kareth paused on a low ridge, scanning the horizon. To the east, the mountains of the wall still loomed. But from here, the southern plains seemed to ripple out in gentle waves of white. Distant stands of forest marked the landscape, and if they looked hard enough, they could almost discern farmland long since harvested before winter set in. Mara felt an unbidden surge of emotion. They had made it past the worst of the Watched Domain, and soon they would be riding into lands that recognized the authority of the great houses, not the Black Cloaks. She reached down to the pouch at her side, touching the shard through the leather. It seemed colder than ever, though perhaps that was just her imagination. "We're close," she whispered. "Closer to Winterfell, anyway." Kareth nodded, lips curving in a grim approximation of hope. "We'll need to travel fast, but at least the terrain should be easier here." He paused, scanning the empty hills. "We'll try to avoid villages. If rumors spread of 2 watchers riding south with no official order, it could bring trouble." They nudged their horses onward, descending the ridge. The snow here was lighter, drifted less deeply. The animals trotted more easily, relieved to be free of the tight canyon. Mara found her gaze sweeping the horizon, as though searching for any sign of settlement. Nothing appeared but endless white hills rolling gently toward distant forests. They made camp that evening in a small copse of pines, using deadfall for a modest fire. The absence of towering canyon walls made the night sky feel wide and open, strewn with countless stars. The north wind still bit, but the air felt slightly less oppressive. They ate what remained of their bread and jerked meat, mindful that their supplies were running dangerously low. Soon they would need to forage or hunt, but in winter that was no easy feat. That night, Mara slept more deeply, exhaustion finally overwhelming her fear. The next morning they woke to a faint pink glow edging the eastern sky. They set out early, eager to put miles behind them. The hills continued for a day or so, then gradually gave way to gentler valleys and small stands of leafless birch. They spotted tracks of deer more than once, though attempts to hunt proved fruitless. The skittish animals fled at the slightest noise. On the 3rd day in this new country, they glimpsed the first sign of civilization. A broken stone fence, half buried in drifts, marking the perimeter of an abandoned pasture. Beyond it stood the remains of a small cottage, roof collapsed under the weight of snow. Mara's heart tightened at the sight of a place once lived in, now reclaimed by winter's emptiness. She wondered if the folk who dwelled there had fled south or died in some past conflict. They continued on. As the sun rose higher, Kareth began to point out distant shapes. The lines of a winding road, a wooden watchtower perched on a hill. "We have to be careful," he murmured. "If that tower is manned, we don't want to be questioned." Mara surveyed it. The structure looked old, leaning slightly, no smoke rising from any nearby building. Probably unmanned or used only in times of war. Still, caution guided them to circle wide. They spent the better part of the day navigating around what seemed to be the outskirts of a once-inhabited region. Now it lay largely empty, perhaps a testament to northern hardships under winter's rule. At dusk, they found a sheltered dell near a creek, still trickling under a skin of ice, where they pitched their small camp. While Kareth gathered kindling, Mara broke a thin layer of ice on the creek to let the horses drink. She knelt by the water, scooping some into her palm and sipping. The cold stung her lips, but it tasted refreshing after so many days of melted snow. She caught her reflection in a still patch. Hollow cheeks, wind-chapped skin, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She hardly recognized the face that peered back. Yet there was a flicker of determination in her gaze, a spark fueled by necessity. She closed her eyes, letting the water slip through her fingers, and thought of the road ahead. Kareth soon returned with an armful of sticks and roots. He built a small fire under the lee of a rock, adding pine needles to help it catch. Mara joined him, rummaging in her pack. She had little left, just a scrap of dried meat, a few crumbs of bread. "We should set snares," she suggested, though she wasn't sure if the area had enough game. "Rabbit, maybe." He nodded, face grim. Better than starving. As night fell, they did their best to craft primitive snares from rope and branches, setting them where they found tracks near the creek. The wind whispered through the bare branches overhead. That night was colder still, and the sky remained clear, stars glinting like shards of ice. Mara curled up in her cloak, knees drawn to her chest, letting the meager fire warm her front while her back remained chilled. She tried to think of anything except the mission, but her mind kept straying to the memory of the children's circle in that grove. She remembered the hush in the air, the glow in those ancient eyes, the sense of inevitability that they would tear down the wall if men failed to pledge. She found no solace in the quiet dark. Sometime before dawn, she jolted awake to a muffled noise. She sat up, hand instinctively going to her sword. The fire had burned low, only embers remained. A figure loomed near the edge of the faint light, and she recognized Kareth's silhouette. He held something in his hands, struggling with a small, wriggling shape. Realization dawned. A hair, caught in one of the snares. Relief coursed through her. At least they had a morsel of food, enough to bolster them for another day or two. They made quick work of the poor creature, skinning and gutting it with practiced efficiency. Mara steeled herself against pity. This was survival. They spitted the meat over the embers, feeding the fire just enough to cook it while trying not to attract unwanted attention with the glow. The scent of roasting flesh filled the chilly air. Their mouths watered at the promise of protein after so many days of sparse rations. They shared the meal in silence, kneeling around the fire. Mara's stomach grumbled with hunger even as she savored each bite. The meat was tough and gamey, but to them, it was a feast. By the time they finished, the sky had lightened, a pale wash of blue creeping into the east. They doused the embers, gathered their meager belongings, and moved on. The rolling terrain gradually leveled out, revealing a patchwork of untended fields and scattered trees. Frozen streams cut across the land like dark veins. As the day advanced, they saw more signs of man-made structures, half-buried stone fences, a broken cartwheel, a leaning barn that looked one storm away from collapse. But still no living souls, not a single wisp of smoke in the distance. They pressed south, guided by Kareth's compass, an old metal piece that still miraculously pointed true. Late in the afternoon, they crested a small rise and spotted what appeared to be a larger track, possibly a road winding through the snow. A few stunted trees lined it in uneven intervals, their branches black and bare. Kareth reined it in, scanning the horizon. "We risk being seen if we travel the road, but we might make better time," he said. Mara gazed at the wide emptiness. "We've seen no one so far," she pointed out. "Any travelers are likely further south. If we follow it from a distance, we can take advantage of the smoother terrain." He agreed, and they guided the horses parallel to that track, keeping a small distance so as not to leave an obvious trail of hoofprints. For a while, it seemed the road led nowhere. Then, around a bend, they saw a small structure, a wooden shrine or marker, half buried in snow. It had a roughly carved figure perched atop a post, maybe a likeness of some old god or saint. The wooden face was worn smooth by years of weather. Mara found herself strangely comforted by this lonely marker, a reminder that once, people moved through these parts with enough faith or superstition to erect a shrine. She and Kareth paused, exchanging glances, then continued on. They pressed forward until the fading light forced them to consider shelter again. A thick copse of trees rose at the road's edge. Beyond it, a stone farmhouse stood in ruins, much like the others they had seen. The roof had partially collapsed, and the door hung askew, battered by wind and storms. With caution, they approached, swords drawn, in case bandits or animals had taken refuge. The inside was dark and smelled of rotting wood. Snow covered the floor in swirling drifts. A few shattered chairs lay strewn about, and the remains of a hearth stood against the far wall. Kareth stepped gingerly around the debris. "Seems empty." A scuttling noise made them both tense, but it was only a rat that darted behind a crumpled sack. They discovered a side room that was slightly less exposed to the elements, a partial roof overhead, beams angled precariously, but still standing. It might serve as windbreak for the night. Mara led the horses inside carefully, finding a corner where the snow wasn't too deep. The animals stamped and snorted, but calmed once they realized it was out of the wind. She rubbed them down, offering a few handfuls of the meager grain they had left. Kareth gathered scraps of broken wood from the shattered furniture, building a small fire in the old stone hearth. Smoke curled up a gap in the collapsed roof. They watched it warily, hoping it wouldn't draw anyone. But the swirling snow outside made it unlikely. They settled there, letting the tired horses doze on their feet. The fire's warmth spread through the half-ruined chamber, and Mara felt her eyelids grow heavy. She stretched her aching legs, back propped against a section of stable wall still intact. "It's not a palace," she murmured with a wry smile, "but it's better than nothing." Kareth breathed out a soft chuckle, though it held more weariness than mirth. "Indeed, we've slept in worse." He pulled out the map, tracing their approximate course. "If we continue south, we should reach the outskirts of the deep forests near the last river. Beyond that, farmland. Then Winterfell lies further southwest, though still a long ride. Could be another week, maybe more, depending on the snow." She nodded, the flickering fire casting shadows across her face. Her fingers went unconsciously to the pouch with the shard, feeling its frigid texture even through the leather. "I hope we can get there soon," she whispered, half to herself. "The children gave us no timeline, but I can't help feeling every day counts." He bowed his head in agreement. "We'll push on at first light again." He placed the map aside, rummaging in the saddlebags for any scraps of food. They had only one small piece of jerked meat left, a handful of grain, and a stale chunk of bread. He handed Mara half of the bread and took the rest for himself, saving the meat for tomorrow. They chewed slowly, each lost in somber thoughts about the coming days. Outside, wind rattled a loose beam, causing the broken roof to groan. But the structure held. The fire crackled, embers glowing like tiny stars in the darkness. After their dismal meal, Kareth banked the flames, reducing them to a steady glow that would last a while without sending a bright beacon through the roof gap. Mara wrapped herself in her cloak, curled on the floor near the hearth, and tried to get comfortable. Kareth took first watch, sitting with his back against the wall, Bao at his side. Drifting in and out of a shallow doze, Mara heard every creak of the old house, every moan of the wind. Sometimes she started awake, convinced she heard chanting like the children's voices, only to realize it was just the wind's high pitch through broken rafters. Then she dreamed of the shard, felt it pressing cold into her palm, shaping her into a blade aimed at the heart of men's kingdoms. It chilled her blood, but she couldn't let it go. Eventually, Kareth nudged her, indicating it was her turn for watch. She rubbed her eyes, nodding groggily. The fire was low, painting the room in faint orange. He lay down in her spot, cloak pulled tight, and was soon asleep. Mara got up, pacing softly around the ruins, checking on the horses. They stood calmly, breath visible in the cold, ears twitching at her quiet steps. She placed a hand on one's neck, feeling the warmth of living flesh, letting it ground her. She moved to what remained of a window, little more than a gap in the stone. The night beyond was heavy with drifting snow. No lights shone for miles. The hush was complete. She found her mind drifting to the question she had tried to ignore. Would men even care to make a pledge with the children? What would it look like, this pledge, that could satisfy ancient beings who believed men had scarred the land? She thought of Winterfell's lords, proud and burdened with their own struggles. She thought of the petty conflicts that raged between southern houses, the politicking alliances that never seemed to end. Would they see the children as a real threat, or simply a legend? The image of the wall collapsing seared her mind again. She swallowed hard, remembering that bone-jarring crack from her nightmares. Dawn came slowly, a pale wash of gray that seeped through the broken roof. Mara roused Kareth, and they prepared to move again. The horses were slow to warm up, stiff from the cold, but eventually they set out, forging south through the light snowfall. The land opened into a broad plain dotted with skeletal trees. Patches of older farmland gave way to rolling meadows, all under a crust of snow. By midday, they spotted the edge of a forest to the west, dark shapes of pines bristling against the horizon. Before they reached the forest, a ruined hamlet appeared, a scattering of stone huts and a broken well in the center. They reined in at the outskirts, scanning for any sign of life. Smoke? Voices? None. The place seemed abandoned for some time. Collapsed roofs, icicles draped over shattered doorways. Yet the sight of it made Mara's heart clench. Ghostly remnants of a village where people once lived. Winter's cruelty, or the realm's endless wars might have driven them away. Still, they decided to search for anything edible. An overlooked store of grain, some salted fish, any morsel that might remain. They walked the horses through the main path, hooves crunching over cracked cobblestones. Snow had drifted inside doorways, half filling the rooms. Kareth pried open one battered door, peered inside a stone shack. Only broken furniture and scraps of cloth. Mara tried another hut. The door hung by one hinge, creaking ominously. Inside, she found a small fireplace, a rotted table, and straw bedding now moldy and frozen. She rummaged around, hoping for a hidden chest. Her nose wrinkled at the stale stench of decay. Some old animal carcass had likely died in here. Cautiously, she lifted a loose floor plank near the hearth, revealing a shallow space. Inside lay a few worm-riddled books and a scattering of dried beans. She picked up the beans, letting them trickle through her fingers. Most were desiccated to the point of uselessness, but she pocketed a handful that looked intact. Outside, Kareth's voice echoed in the hush. "Find anything?" She re-emerged, wiping dust from her gloves. "A few beans. Not much else." She handed them over, and he frowned, nodding. "Better than nothing," he said. "I found a bucket that might still hold water without leaking too badly." Together, they moved on to the next hut. Empty. The next, likewise. In the last one, Kareth kicked aside some rubble and discovered half a sack of old, shriveled root vegetables. Turnips, perhaps. They had shrunk and hardened to lumps, but might still be edible if boiled. It was a pitiful find, but they gathered them eagerly. A stroke of desperate luck might keep them alive a little longer. As they mounted up and left the hamlet behind, Mara felt the pit of her stomach twist at the realization that even the basics of survival were precarious. She tried to imagine how people had once gone about ordinary lives here. Children playing the lanes, smoke curling from chimneys, folks gathering in the evenings to share store. Now it lay silent, an echo of the realm's fragility, and that realm was threatened by powers older than any king or lord. They continued westward, deciding to skirt the edge of the looming forest rather than plunge into it. The going was somewhat easier on the plains. They made decent progress until late afternoon, when the weather shifted again. Clouds gathered overhead, an iron-gray mass that promised heavy snowfall. The wind rose, biting at their exposed skin. Kareth scouted the horizon with a hand shielding his eyes. "We'll need shelter," he said, scanning for any sign of a structure or natural cover. "This storm looks worse than the last." Mara squinted. The forest to their left was thick with conifers, offering a chance of cover among the tall pines, but if the snow fell too hard, they might lose their way inside. To the right, rolling meadows extended for miles, with no cover in sight. She bit her lip. "Let's chance the forest. We might find a hollow or a rocky outcrop. Anything to block the wind." He agreed. They angled their horses into the line of trees. The wind lashed at them as they crossed the open ground, heads bowed. By the time they reached the forest's edge, the storm had already started, thick flakes swirling in chaotic gusts. Darkness rushed in early, the sky cut off by low, churning clouds. The pines groaned and swayed, sending clumps of snow tumbling from the branches. They pressed deeper, weaving among the trunks. Their world shrank to the narrow space between snow-laden boughs. They rode for what felt like an hour, scanning for any rock formations that might form a shelter. The snow fell faster, piling atop the horses' manes, swirling around their ankles. The animals began to tire, stepping carefully to avoid hidden roots. Mara's cheeks burned from the cold, and her fingers had gone numb despite thick gloves. She tried to keep her cloak wrapped tight, but the wind found every gap. Just when she thought they might have to bed down at the foot of a pine, Kareth halted. "Look," he called. Ahead, through the swirling white, stood a rocky escarpment. The slope of stone rose amid the trees, draped in ice and crusted with snow. They urged their horses toward it, searching the base. A small overhang protruded near the ground, enough to shield them from above. It wasn't a cave, just a narrow recess. But anything was better than sleeping exposed. Working together, they cleared branches and loose stones, carving out space for themselves and the horses. The overhang provided a scant few feet of overhead protection, yet it broke the worst of the driving snow. Once they settled, Kareth used his hatchet to cut some branches into firewood. Mara scraped away snow to form a makeshift pit. They managed to coax a small flame to life, the sparks catching on dry pine needles, then flickering into a tiny blaze. The storms howling outside intensified. Wind hissed through the forest, rattling branches and spraying flurries in every direction. Snow swirled beyond the fire's weak circle of light. Darkness descended, and the temperature plummeted. The horses huddled close, nostrils flaring, as Kareth draped them with blankets. Mara rubbed her hands near the flames, half delirious with cold and exhaustion. For supper, they had only their meager finds, some roasted turnip lumps and the leftover beans. They had no proper pot, only a battered tin cup in which they tried to soften the beans over the fire. The resulting mash tasted bland, almost sour, but they ate every scrap, grateful for the meager nourishment. The flickering light cast shadows on the rock above them, where icicles hung like sharp teeth. After eating, they set about making their bedrolls. There was little conversation, both felt the weight of the day's effort and the urgent need to preserve energy. The storm outside raged, a deep, pulsing roar, as gusts of wind funneled through the trees. Snow drifted across the opening of their makeshift shelter, threatening to seal them in if it piled too high. Every now and then, Kareth rose to shovel it aside with a broken pine branch. Mara tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't still. She stared at the flicker of the dying fire, thinking of the vow she carried, one not recognized by any living man, but demanded by ancient beings. The shard throbbed with a faint, insistent cold against her side, as though reminding her of what was at stake. She imagined the wall trembling under unseen forces, hairline cracks spreading through the ice. If they failed, if no lord or king believed their tale, entire kingdoms might be swallowed by winter's wrath. She turned onto her side, curling up, hoping to shut out those visions. The wind howled like a chorus of lamenting spirits, and the trees groaned overhead. She heard Kareth shift in his bedroll, no doubt wrestling with his own ghosts. Eventually, she drifted into restless sleep, the storm's roar thrumming in her ears like a distant heartbeat. Dawn arrived, though it was hard to see the sun through the thick, swirling flurries. Their shelter was nearly snowed in, the drift piled high at the entrance. Kareth shoved his way out, cursing softly at the effort required. Outside, the forest was a monochrome realm of gray and white. The wind had died somewhat, leaving behind a muffled silence. Huge drifts blocked their path in every direction. They would have to dig a path for the horses, possibly for hours, to continue south. Defeat weighed on them, but they set to work, forging a way through the waist-high snow. Their muscles burned, breath coming in ragged gasps. The horses seemed reluctant to move, but eventually they managed to guide them out. The pines stood in thick clusters, branches sagging under the snow's weight. Mara's boots sank at every step, forcing her to lift her legs high like wading through a deep river. They trudged for what felt like an eternity, stopping often to catch their breath. Kareth led, scanning for the easiest route. The ground sloped slightly downward, so they followed a gentle decline, hoping it would lead them out of the forest. After an hour of this slow, punishing pace, they emerged into a clearing where the drifts weren't quite as deep. There, they paused, panting, leaning on their horses for support. A faint noise made Mara tense, like a distant horn or a call. She lifted her head, peering through the swirling snow. Kareth heard it too, eyes narrowed. They waited, listening, but the sound did not repeat. The forest remained still aside from the whisper of falling flakes. Perhaps it had been the wind in the branches, or some bird's cry distorted by the snow. Feeling uneasy, they pressed on. The clearing sloped downward, dotted with young saplings. Soon, the trees grew sparse, and they found themselves overlooking a broad, snow-laden plain. In the far distance, a dark line might have been a larger forest or foothills. Mara couldn't be sure in the haze. Kareth pointed, gesturing that they should continue. With a soft nudge of the reins, they urged the horses onward, praying the snow would be shallow enough here to maintain a steady pace. They crossed the plain as the morning wore on, navigating small rises and swales. On one such rise, they stopped, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The wind carried only a hush. Then, just as they started forward, they saw a shape, a lone figure trudging across the snow. It was far away, barely discernible, but clearly human. The figure seemed to limp, stopping often, as though exhausted. Mara and Kareth exchanged a wary glance. Could be trouble, Kareth muttered, unstrapping his bow. But also might be someone who needs help. She nodded, heart pounding with the echo of caution. We can't ignore them. Perhaps it was foolish, but she couldn't bear the thought of leaving a lone traveler to die in the cold, if they were simply lost. They urged their horses in that direction, moving carefully. As they drew closer, details emerged. The figure wore ragged furs, face obscured by a hood pulled low. They carried a crude staff or pole, leaning on it heavily. When the traveler spotted them, they stopped, half turning as if to flee. Then, seeing only two riders, they remained still, trembling. Kareth raised a hand in a gesture of peace. "Oh there," he called. "We mean no harm." The figure's voice came in a hoarse rasp. "Stay back." It was a woman's voice, laced with both fear and desperation. "I've got a knife." Mara dismounted slowly, approaching with palms raised. "We're not here to rob or hurt you," she said, trying to keep her tone gentle. "You look cold and injured." The woman's stance wavered. She was indeed limping, face partially visible. A bruise darkened one cheek, and her eyes were hollow, rimmed with red from the wind. Kareth hung back, bow at the ready in case this was a trick. But the traveler merely sagged, struggling to stay upright. I got separated from my kin," she said, voice catching. "Wildlings near the Shivering Forest. We were attacked by raiders or something. I ran." She coughed, a harsh sound. Her shoulders shook with fatigue. Mara's heart twisted. This woman, likely a wildling or a deserter from some group, was alone in the deep winter. She stepped closer, ignoring the woman's weak attempt to raise the staff in defense. Gently, she said, "We have a little food, water. Let us help you." The woman's eyes flicked between Mara and Kareth, suspicion written in every line of her face. But she was too exhausted to resist. Her staff drooped, and she let Mara come close. Kareth dismounted, taking a few cautious steps forward. "Drink," he said, holding out a water skin. She gulped greedily, some of the water spilling down her chin. Then she sank to her knees, chest heaving as though simply standing had drained her. Mara knelt beside her, rummaging in her pack. She handed over a small piece of turnip from their dwindling supply. The woman bit into it, grimacing at the taste, but chewed quickly. Shivering, she pulled her hood tighter around her face. Mara noticed her hair was matted with ice, the furs ragged. "Thank you," the woman mumbled between bites, eyes darting. "You're crows, aren't you? You wear black." Mara exchanged a glance with Kareth. "We were," she admitted softly. "But we're traveling south on our own mission. We won't harm you." She hesitated. "We could bring you with us until we find a safer place." The wildling let out a brittle laugh. "I doubt you'll find anywhere safe in this cursed winter, but I can't go on alone. My leg," she winced, gently touching her shin, "fell when the fighting started. I think it's bruised to the bone." Kareth studied her a moment, then shrugged. "One more traveler won't slow us too much if you can ride." He moved to help her stand, though she flinched at his touch. After a moment, she allowed him to hoist her up. leaning on her staff. "What's your name?" She eyed him warily. "Suna," she said at last, voice still raw. "My people and I were looking for an easier crossing. Then we were set upon. I ran." Her tone held a mix of guilt and sorrow. "I couldn't fight them." Mara nodded sympathetically. "We've seen camps, small groups. Times are desperate everywhere." Kareth guided his horse closer. "Climb up. We'll share a saddle. Just until we find somewhere you can rest." Suna hesitated, but accepted his help, gritting her teeth against pain as she mounted. He swung up behind, supporting her so she wouldn't topple. Mara offered the woman her cloak to add another layer. Suna murmured something like thanks, though her eyes still held a guarded fear. Thus, they continued south, the three of them and 2 horses, forging a careful path across the plain. Suna clung to the horse's mane, occasionally biting back groans when her injured leg jostled. Kareth kept one arm around her waist, guiding the animal gently. Mara rode behind, scanning the distance in all directions, alert for any sign of raiders or trouble. The day remained cold and overcast, but at least the snow had ceased, leaving a sullen gray sky overhead. They covered little ground that day, slowed by Suna's condition and the need to avoid rough terrain. The woman shared bits of her story in halting phrases. She and a small band of wildlings had left the far north, hoping to slip across the wall or go around it, seeking rumored settlements that traded food for pelts. Instead, they found conflict. She didn't know whether her kin were dead or scattered. Her eyes shone with a haunted light whenever she mentioned them. Evening drew near, and they had to find shelter once more. The land sloped into a wide valley, ringed by patches of forest. Kareth spotted an outcrop of stone that might provide some cover. They guided the horses there, discovering a shallow hollow at the base where the ground dipped. It offered just enough windbreak to make a camp. They helped Suna down, letting her lean on the staff. She winced, hissing in pain. While Kareth gathered wood for a fire, Mara tended to Suna's leg. She peeled back the ragged fur and cloth, revealing a swollen bruise from ankle to mid-calf. No open wound, but the flesh was discolored, and any pressure made her gasp. Mara pressed gently around the bone, relieved it wasn't obviously broken, though it might be cracked. "You'll have to rest it," she said. "Try not to put too much weight on it for a few days at least." "Doc." Suna laughed bitterly. "Days? Out here?" She squeezed her eyes shut. "What choice do I have?" Mara wrapped the leg with strips of cloth from her own spare shirt, creating a sort of makeshift brace. Suna hissed through her teeth but allowed it. When finished, Mara settled back. Kareth had lit a small fire, coaxing the flames to life with precious bits of tinder. They gathered close, letting the warmth seep into their numb limbs. The horses stood nearby, heads drooping. The valley lay silent, no wind stirring. Overhead the clouds hung heavy, threatening more snow. An uneasy calm settled over their tiny circle. Suna looked from Mara to Kareth, eyes flicking over their black garments. "You left the watch," she said, half a question and half an accusation. Mara hesitated, then nodded. "We had to. Something important is happening. We need to reach Winterfell." Suna studied her face. "Important enough to risk being branded deserters?" Kareth cast a glance at Mara before responding. He said quietly. "The future of the realm may depend on it." Suna gave a humorless snort. "The realm?" She let the words hang in the cold air. "Your realm, maybe." Mara felt the shards chill against her side, reminding her that this wasn't a matter of lords or even of the Watch. It was about a force older than men's petty boundaries. Something that could shatter the land's defenses if no pledge was made. She said nothing, letting the fire's crackling speak into the silence. They shared a scant meal, what was left of the root vegetables and a little water. Suna ate ravenously, eyes closed as though savoring every bite despite the blandness. Then she curled up near the flames, cloak pulled tight, drifting into a restless sleep punctuated by low groans whenever her legs shifted. Mara and Kareth exchanged a look. He shrugged, expression resigned. "We'll have to take her as far as we can. Can't leave her to die." Mara nodded, a weary ache behind her eyes. "We'll manage," she said, though she wasn't sure how. Their supplies were nearly gone, their own journey still long, and now they had an injured stranger to carry. Yet she couldn't imagine abandoning the woman. The memory of deserted hamlets, the emptiness of the winter-scarred land, all told her that no one else would help. Late that night, as the fire burned low, Mara lay staring at the starless sky overhead. She sensed the weight of that shard pressing on her belt, the intangible burden of a mission no one else understood. Suna's soft whimpers mingled with the hiss of embers. She thought of the children again, of their luminous eyes. They were so certain men had broken the land. Perhaps in moments like this, it was hard to argue otherwise. Everywhere, people were scattered, starved or afraid. Yet she clung to a sliver of hope. Winterfell lay ahead, a place where the old gods were still honored. If anywhere in the south might listen, it would be there. And if they did, maybe, just maybe, the land could be spared from a cataclysm that would swallow every living thing. That fragile hope was all that kept her going as sleep finally claimed her. Shrouded in darkness and the soft crackle of dying flames, dawn brought a fresh dusting of snow. Mara rose, stiff and cold, to find Suna awake, gazing at her leg in sullen dismay. Kareth was already tending the horses, feeding them the last of the grain. Another day of slow travel loomed. They shared hushed words, deciding to aim south by southeast, hoping to find a main road or a safer path that Suna could endure. They had no illusions of easy riding. Before setting off, Mara looked at the horizon. The sky was a pale expanse of silver, the sun barely aglow behind thinning clouds. Each day brought them closer to the heart of the north, closer to Winterfell. And each day brought the realm closer to the children's reckoning. If no pledge was found, she pressed a hand to the shard through her pouch, feeling that biting chill one more time, and then she turned to mount her horse. Kareth helped Suna onto his saddle, and together they began another day's journey across the white plains. Snow crunched beneath hooves. The valley stretched endless before them. Far beyond that horizon, the seat of House Stark waited, perhaps the only hope of forging a new pact. And time flowed on, unstoppable as the relentless winter.